In February 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made a decision that shocked the global community. He invaded Ukraine. That war was meant to be a smash-and-grab operation, with Russia rolling in on tanks to secure Kyiv before establishing its rule in Ukraine as a whole. And it almost worked. Russian forces managed to enter Kyiv, albeit briefly, before resistance fighters pushed them back. Then that resistance started gathering steam. Most of the Western world supported Ukraine financially and provided military equipment, giving Kyiv the ability to fight back against Putin's aggression. To date, Western nations have pledged and provided over $380 billion in aid to Ukraine, with more on the way. This wasn't what Putin wanted. What was supposed to be an easy victory has devolved into a multi-year war that looks unlikely to end anytime soon. And yet, rather than withdrawing from Ukraine and accepting that it isn't going to achieve the easy victory it anticipated, Russia keeps pushing forward with the fight. But why? Putin's arrogance. That will be the focus of this video, as we explore how Putin's arrogance has led him into a no-win situation in Ukraine, and how, terrifyingly for the Russian public, Putin's ambition could be the death of his country. But before we dig into how Putin's arrogance will destroy Russia, we need to learn a little bit more about the man. Specifically, what drove him to invade Ukraine in the first place. Whenever he speaks publicly, Putin offers hints to one of the main reasons he invaded Ukraine. He is, if nothing else, a patriot, and he longs for the days when Russia was one of the world's most powerful countries. Putin wants to restore the glory days of the Soviet Union, ignoring all of the internal strife that period caused in his country, and wishes to restore Russia's dominance over the rest of Europe. We can see snippets of this agenda coming through in Putin's February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson. In this interview, Putin tries to position himself less as an aggressor to the Ukrainian people and more as a savior to not only the country but the rest of Europe. Specifically, he claims that the denazification of Ukraine was one of his main goals with the war, with Putin telling Carlson, "We haven't achieved our aims yet because one of them is denazification." A seemingly noble cause. However, in one of the few times when Carlson pressed an issue in that interview, Putin was later asked if he would be satisfied with the territory he has now if he wins in Ukraine. Putin didn't respond to that question, instead returning to his point of denazifying Ukraine. The takeaway? Putin wouldn't be satisfied with just claiming Ukraine. He wants to restore Russia to its former glory. Other parts of that interview deliver a more direct throughline into his thinking. At various points, Putin engages in long and rambling diatribes, which he dresses up as history lessons, talking about how Russia and Europe were in the past. Though long-winded, these discussions reveal that Putin still sees Europe in old terms, with part of his justification for invading Ukraine seemingly boiling down to it was part of Russia before, and so it should be part of Russia now. To anybody who'd been paying attention to Putin's rhetoric when the war started, this was nothing new. In February 2024, the same month Russia invaded Ukraine, The Guardian reported on an hour-long speech Putin gave, in which he delivered his version of the history of Ukraine. Notable snippets from that interview include Putin claiming, "Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space," as well as claiming the Bolsheviks made a massive mistake when they recognized Ukraine as a republic. The claims on land kept coming, when he also discussed how ceding territory as part of ending World War I was another mistake, along with lamentations of the loss of territory of the former Russian Empire. By this point, Putin's agenda seems clear. He wants a return to the old Russia. And to some, that may not be a sign of arrogance. It's natural for a patriot to want to see his country reclaim the glory days and take its position as a leader on the global stage. However, Putin's desire to restore Russia isn't driven by his love of country. It's driven by revenge and a desire for personal power. After all, Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is far from the first time that he's tried to control the country. It's just the most direct military attempt. He's made several tries at establishing Russian dominance in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. Take Ukraine's 2004 presidential election as an example. That election saw Putin's first real attempt to create what he calls managed democracy, a term the Carnegie Endowment for Peace says Putin uses to describe the type of regime he wants to create. In short, Putin doesn't want full democracy. He wants a shadow version, in which elections are held, but they're so lopsided toward his agenda that they may as well not exist. To that end, he poured all of his efforts into helping Ukraine's then Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, secure the country's presidency. He failed. Despite spending an enormous amount of money on Yanukovych's campaign, as well as attempting to hinder the rest of the world's understanding of the election result, Putin couldn't get his puppet into office. Allegations of voter fraud abounded, with outgoing President Leonid Kuchma told that he had to dismiss the Central Election Commission's chairman by Charles Tannock, the European Parliament's delegation for Ukraine. Tannock said the chairman had clearly not been above board, going on to cite figures that suggested several parts of the country had seen voter turnouts of more than 100%. He added that absentee ballot abuse, ballot stuffing, and even intimidation of voters had taken place. Putin even campaigned on behalf of his preferred candidate, only to see tens of thousands of Yanukovych's opponent's supporters line the streets of Kyiv to protest the official tally that had placed Yanukovych 3 points ahead. That opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, eventually received the backing of most of the Ukrainian parliament. The country's Supreme Court ended up annulling the election result, with Yushchenko coming out on top in a fairer vote several weeks later. Putin ended up shooting himself in the foot. By so radically backing Yanukovych to the point that he tried to pull off election fraud, Putin ended up with a president in Ukraine that he didn't want, and one who wouldn't be open to conciliatory talks with Russia. With his political maneuvering in tatters, Putin instead tried to rely on the KGB to get rid of Ukraine's president. Putin has been accused of attempting to assassinate Yushchenko soon after he took office, with that attempt failing as spectacularly as his attempt to influence the 2004 election in Ukraine. Putin was humiliated. In particular, his ego took a massive shot as the pride he felt as an astute political leader who could effortlessly influence policies in other countries was proven to be false. His efforts had blown up in his face, and he wasn't going to take the humiliation lying down. Though Putin veered away from trying to kill Yushchenko after his first assassination attempt ended, he still tried to have an impact on Ukraine's stability. We see this from multiple gas crises in Ukraine experienced as a result of Russian actions in 2006 and 2009. Both years saw Russia cut gas supplies off, supposedly due to disputes about pricing, with the effects of those cutoffs reverberating far beyond Ukraine. Russia has also spent the last 20 years building pipelines that allow it to circumvent Ukraine, this time creating a situation in which it could cut the country off while still maintaining relationships with other nations. You could argue that this attempt to scuttle Ukraine had a greater impact. A year after the second cutoff, Putin finally got his man, Viktor Yanukovych, in office. Between 2010 and 2014, Yanukovych reigned as president and immediately began making changes to the constitution. Putin had what he wanted, at least for a short time. But then the Euromaidan protests came in 2013 as a direct response to Yanukovych's refusal to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. Instead, Ukraine's president ignored the country's parliament, which had voted overwhelmingly to approve the deal, and instead chose to create another trade agreement with Russia. As they did following the results of the 2004 election, Ukrainians took to the streets. Violent clashes between protesters and Ukrainian state forces resulted, with Yanukovych ultimately being run out of Ukraine. The country's parliament chose to remove him with a vote of 380 to 0, and Ukraine restored its constitution to what it had been in 2004. Putin had once again lost influence. Russian media cries of a coup fell on deaf ears. However, the protests and ousting of Yanukovych did open the door for Putin to annex Crimea, taking control of the territory away from Ukraine. This was the first sign of the lengths Putin was willing to go to in order to take the entire country. But by this point, he was likely no longer as fueled by a desire to reclaim the former Russia as he had been in the past. He had a personal agenda. Ukraine had humiliated him multiple times. It had gotten rid of the leader he wanted in power twice and survived even when he cut off gas supplies. Even the annexation of Crimea wasn't the victory Putin was hoping for. Ukraine still carried on, building stronger ties with the West as Putin saw the country slipping further and further out of his grip. His ego couldn't take it. And in his arrogance, Putin decided that he could take Ukraine easier by force rather than accepting the country as an independent state over which he had no real control. In this context, we can start to see the war in a different light. While Putin outwardly claims the war is about denazification and the restoration of the old Russia, internally there's a clear element of personal vendetta at play. Ukraine spent nearly 20 years deflecting Putin's influence, political, economic, and even military, showing Putin to be far less powerful as a political player than he believed himself to be. And that leads us to the third reason why Putin launched his war in Ukraine. Personal power may mean more to him than Russian dominance. Putin became Russia's president in December 1999, following a surprise address delivered by former President Boris Yeltsin. It was a rapid rise to power for a man who had only been appointed as Russia's prime minister 4 months previously, and in May 2000, Putin was inaugurated for his first full 4-year term after just scraping through an election with 53% of the nation's vote. No Russian election has been as close ever since. Putin won with 71.9% of the vote in 2004, with the next election taking place 8 years later, despite Russia supposedly having 4-year terms. That one was a little closer, with Putin taking 63.6% of the vote, though his nearest competitor, Gennady Zyuganov, only racked up 17.8%. 6 years later, Putin won another election, this time with 76.69% of the vote, with the most recent 2024 election seeing him take 87.29%. This is Putin's managed democracy in action, a system where he appears to compete with other candidates in elections that some accuse of being rigged. Putin has now tallied 24 years as the president of Russia, with no end in sight, and he'll likely try to maintain that position for the rest of his life. But what's interesting here isn't necessarily the possible rigging of elections over the last 24 years. Rather, Putin has also used war on multiple occasions to justify his position as Russia's leader. Open Democracy notes one theory that suggests the second Chechen campaign of 1999 helped Putin achieve his rapid political ascent. From previously being a relative unknown in Russian politics, he rose to become the president less than a year after that campaign, gaining a ton of popular support in the process. While the organization claims that theory likely isn't correct based on opinion polls at the time, Putin himself may believe that being seen as a strong wartime leader helped him to take the reins of power. Later wars, such as his Georgia campaign of 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, may have been less about claiming territory for Russia as they were creating a situation in which Putin could be seen as a strong leader. Sow some seeds of chaos and encourage the people to back their current leader ahead of anyone who might challenge him. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has led him to believe that he is the only leader that Russia can rely on. He does everything he can to maintain power, with his 2022 invasion of Ukraine possibly being the latest attempt by him to stir up national pride so he keeps himself where he wants to be. And it appears to have worked, at least if you believe Russia's 2024 election results are legitimate. By this point, it's clear that Putin's arrogance is fueled by a combination of his desire to return Russia to its former glory and a need to be seen as the man who did it, a personal vendetta against Ukraine, and his thirst for power. But what Putin doesn't realize is that very arrogance may have placed Russia on the edge of destruction. Let's start explaining why by taking a closer look at the impact the Ukraine war has had on Putin and Russia as a whole. Putin's initial invasion was far from successful. Though Russian troops managed to enter Kyiv, they were repelled in what AP News calls a defeat for the ages. Russia also suffered tremendous losses to its Black Sea fleet and may have lost as many as 342 planes and 325 helicopters, if reports from Ukraine are accurate. Its personnel losses are at least 85,000, with Ukraine claiming they're much higher, which has forced Russia to engage in a war of attrition in which it attempts to wear Ukraine down. That alone has been damaging to Russia. Though the world still views Russia as a strong military power, it's no longer seen as one that can roll over a country that's meant to be substantially weaker than it. Granted, Russia would likely have won in Ukraine already were it not for the international aid that has propped up Kyiv almost since the war began. But Putin's arrogance, in assuming he could take Ukraine in a matter of weeks, has instead revealed Russia's military to be outdated and too reliant on numbers rather than modern equipment and sound strategy. In other words, a stronger country than Ukraine might now feel more confident in its chances of winning a war against Russia in the future. And that's especially the case after they've seen Russia lose so much of its modern equipment, forcing it to repurpose old Soviet hardware to keep its war machine churning. It gets worse for Russia. Whether it wins or loses the war in Ukraine, the country as a whole is going to feel the negative effects for years to come. A loss would likely result in it being stuck with the bill for rebuilding a country it has spent 2 years destroying, as well as Russia having to deal with being a less capable player on the geopolitical stage. It would also likely have to deal with long-running sanctions in the aftermath of a loss, such as a potential extension of the $60 per barrel cap currently in place on Russian oil. Then there's the continuation of other sanctions that have lowered the country's economic gross domestic product, forecast by 7% compared to pre-war estimates. And if Putin wins his war, he'll face the exact same problems. Those who oppose him and Russian aggression as a whole will keep sanctions in place, potentially for years to come. He'll also still need to spend big on rebuilding Ukraine. After all, he claims that it should be part of Russia, and he'll want it to be a functioning part rather than a ghost country that can offer little more than shelled-out buildings. Worse yet for Putin, his rebuilding efforts would likely have to be done under the shadow of continuous Ukrainian resistance, meaning it will likely cost more to rebuild Ukraine if he wins than it would if he loses. Economically, Russia may not be able to survive no matter the results of Putin's war. That may seem like a strange claim on the surface. The International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy to grow 3.2% in 2024, which is a full 2 percentage points higher than the UK and nearly the same amount higher than the EU. Its budget deficit is also much lower than both, tracking at 1% of GDP compared to the UK's 5.1% and the EU's 2.8%. All signs of a thriving economy, right? However, these figures hide the fact that Russia's economy is far from diverse. It relies heavily on exporting oil and gas, with so much of its recent economic growth stemming from the fact that it's able to charge so heavily for both as a result of the war that Putin started. So what happens when the war ends? Russia will be forced to pull those prices back down if it wants to continue selling its main exports, which is when the country will have to wake up to the economic issues that Putin's arrogance has caused. Take how he's spending the country's national budget. Russia is dedicating around 40% of that budget to the wartime effort, with total military spending reaching about 5.9% of GDP in 2023. That money is going toward paying soldiers, building tanks and planes, compensating the families of dead soldiers, and buying equipment from other countries that it can use to fund its war. When the war ends, that entire economic crutch crumbles. The thousands who currently have jobs in Russian factories building military equipment will find themselves out of work. Russia itself will see that it has very little left over in the national budget, and as a result of victory, the country would find itself increasingly isolated from the global community, and the West in particular, leaving it reliant on countries like China to prop it up. Speaking of China, Putin also doesn't realize just how much control Beijing has over Russia's fate. Take oil as an example. With the rest of Europe drastically reducing how much oil it buys from Russia in the wake of Putin's war, now only accounting for 4.5% of purchases, Russia is increasingly relying on China and India to purchase its products. Together, those countries now account for 90% of Russia's crude oil exports, which is a clear example of a lack of diversification. China is the main buyer here, with Reuters pointing out that it now buys 50% of the oil that Russia produces. That's good news for Russia in the short term. It's able to keep bringing oil money in, even as Europe drops from buying 45% of its production to 4%. However, it also leaves the country in a position where it's increasingly reliant on China to fund its economy. That leads to the obvious question: what happens if China stops buying Russian oil? That may not be a far-flung question, given China's recent reaction to threats of sanctions being placed against it for doing business with Russia. Reuters reports that many of China's major banks are pulling back on financing transactions related to Russia, forcing companies to turn to small and less reliable banks, or in some cases cryptocurrency, to continue doing business. The news outlet quotes a banker at one of China's Big Four when talking about the reason. The main reason is to avoid unnecessary troubles. In other words, the banks don't want to be sanctioned, as that could affect Chinese trade globally. While this banking shutdown appears to be mostly related to consumer goods and similar types of businesses, it shows us what China is willing to do if it faces increasing international pressure. Who's to say that it wouldn't stop buying Russian oil or reduce the amount it's paying to meet the $60 cap Western nations have placed on the country's oil if it faced a significant amount of pressure? Either way, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has placed Russia in a no-win situation with China. If it continues relying on China to buy its gas and oil ahead of practically any other nation, it gives Beijing control over its purse strings. That could be a problem if China decides it wants to negotiate lower prices than Russia wants to charge, especially because Russia is quickly losing leverage that would allow it to keep prices high. And if China keeps pulling out of business dealings, as we're seeing as a result of the West's most recent sanction threats, Russia will realize that it's so dependent on China that it's little more than the country's junior partner. Not great for a man who wants to be seen as one of the leaders of the modern world. Certainly not a good outcome for a Russia that's already struggling to prop up an economy that's almost entirely dependent on war, oil, and gas. But Putin's actions haven't just harmed Russia's economy. They've also altered the global perception of the nation. We touched on this earlier when we pointed out that Putin's past failed attempts to control Ukraine ended in failure and exposed him as a less effective leader than he believes himself to be. And even though the world is rightfully wary of the threat Russia presents militaristically, it's also seeing a Russia that's struggling to defeat a much smaller country, albeit one that's being supported by the global community. Putin's arrogance has made Russia look weak, and he has also made himself look like a schoolyard bully. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, which says that Putin's repeated threats of using tactical nukes in Ukraine are the sign of a man who's growing desperate. He wants Ukraine, the former Soviet territories, and the Western world at large to fear him. Instead, his actions are waking up many other countries to the threat that he presents as Russia's leader, which could, ironically, cause that threat to be limited. The reactions seen in the former Soviet states demonstrate that. In September 2022, Politico reported on the many losses of Russian influence across these states. For instance, Azerbaijan started shelling Armenia again during that month, breaking a ceasefire that Moscow had brokered. It was confident enough to do that because Putin pulled Russia's best troops out of the South Caucasus region, leaving the Russian-backed Armenia exposed. In Georgia, the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine is often flown in support of the embattled nation. Putin also saw himself snubbed by Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who went as far as to claim his country doesn't recognize quasi-state territories, which, in our view, is what Luhansk and Donetsk are. Both are territories Russia currently controls in the war. The point here is that Putin is already struggling to control portions of his supposed empire, with a single war weakening his, and by extension, Russia's influence in these regions. Again, an example of how the Russian president's arrogance is actually weakening his country. Even more worrying are the reactions of the Western world to Putin's invasion. French President Emmanuel Macron has already claimed that NATO troops entering Ukraine is a possibility. And even though the rest of NATO denies this, Macron hasn't backed down from his comments and even claimed as recently as May 2, 2024, that there's still a possibility that French troops could enter the country. Even the many NATO members who won't commit troops are still sending plenty of aid. The UK recently approved $620 million in aid. With the United States going 100 times bigger, it's approved $61 billion in April. The problem for Russia is that this shows Europe and the Western world at large is slowly waking up to Putin's ambitions. Many countries are now increasing their military budgets in response to Russia's invasion, ultimately meaning they will be able to put up a much stronger fight if Putin tries to coerce or cow them. Far from claiming Ukraine as a great victory for Russia, Putin has galvanized Europe to the point where it will now be much harder for him to achieve his ambitions of returning his country to its Soviet-era glory days. Instead, Russia will just face stronger sanctions, a dearth of clients for its gas and oil, and will have to confront the fact that its economy is now almost wholly reliant on a combination of war and Chinese money. And then there's the last potential nail in the coffin: the massive demographic damage done to Russia as a result of the war. Russians are leaving their home country at a rate of hundreds of thousands. The Economist says that the outbreak of war led to an exodus of 300,000 people, with the BBC saying that estimates for the numbers since range from the hundreds of thousands to several millions. That's all happening against the backdrop of an extended demographic crisis that Russia has experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet era, the country's birth rate halved due to the uncertainty its people had as a result of economic hardship. Raising those birth rates has been a cause close to Putin's heart since he took power, and he's failed every step of the way. Our World in Data says that Russia saw just 9.6 births for every 17 deaths in 2021. With the war in Ukraine killing so many of Russia's younger people, along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more leaving, there may not be much of a Russia left by the time the war is over. All of this adds up to a country in crisis, one that, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, is in dire straits economically and in terms of geopolitical positioning. A Russia that's losing people at an alarming rate, and one that, as a result of Putin's arrogance and actions, could find itself playing second fiddle to China rather than rebuilding its empire in the coming years. But what do you think? Will Putin's arrogance truly lead to Russia's downfall? Or will victory in Ukraine give him the launching pad to rebuild what he believes the country has lost? How long would it take for Russia to rebuild in the wake of the war, especially if it loses? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Putin warns destruction of civilization is close, or click this other video instead.
The date is February 16th, 2023, and an online vote is in progress. For the next 12 days, the poll will remain open, giving voters a chance to voice their opinion on a single issue: should Siberia become independent of Russia? On the first day alone, 130,000 people cast their votes. Many thousands more will do so in the days that follow, participating in a referendum that may well be illegal in Russian law. After all, a vote related to Siberia's independence could be seen as casting aspersions on Russia's territorial integrity. especially if that vote reveals that the people in Siberia want to secede. The referendum's organizers don't care about legality. On February 28, the online voting for what was dubbed the National Online Referendum on Self-Determination of National Republics closed. All told, 5 territories took part in the voting. Beyond Siberia, the Urals, Kuban, Ingria, and Königsberg regions voted, with the Center for Countering Disinformation reporting that some 5.6 million people cast their votes in this supposedly illegal referendum. The results won't make Vladimir Putin happy. Across the board, the referendums showed that all 5 territories wanted independence. In Siberia, 63.9% said that the territory should be free, with only 36.1% wanting it to stay under Russian control. That result alone is enough evidence that there is a definite separatist movement developing in Siberia, fueled by campaign slogans such as "Enough to feed Moscow" and "Enough to die for the Kremlin." Siberians want economic, political, and territorial independence from their Russian overlords, which leads us to the question that we aim to answer in this video. Why? After so long under Russian control, why are there so many Siberians casting the yes vote in an online referendum calling for independence? Before we can start to put together some of the modern-day answers to that question, we first need to go on a journey into Siberia's complicated past. Siberia is a huge territory that takes up over 5.2 million square miles. However, the Russians define the territory as being much narrower, taking in 2.529 million square miles, which are divided into 2 economic planning regions, Eastern and Western Siberia. That region contains several republics, all controlled by Russia, including Altai, Taiva, Sakha, Khakassia, and Buryatia. But it hasn't always been this way. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, it's not clear when the first people arrived in Siberia. However, there is evidence of Paleolithic settlements, which stretches back from 10,000 BC to over 2.5 million years ago, meaning it's safe to assume that people have been in Siberia for at least 12,000 years. There is also evidence to suggest that the early Siberians participated in the Bronze Age. However, the territory doesn't begin to gain any importance on the geopolitical stage until around 1000 BC, when it falls under the influence of the expanding Chinese Empire during the Qin dynasty. By 300 BC, the region had been wrested from Chinese control and was under Mongol influence, with the southern regions of the territory being part of the Mongols' Khanate of the Golden Horde for around 500 years between the 10th and 15th centuries. It was during the 16th century that Russia first came into the picture. The Library of Congress reports that the first official Russian incursion into the territory came in 1581, when Ermak Timofeyevich, a Cossack hetman or military commander, led a detachment of troops over the Ural Mountains. There he fought and defeated the Khanate of Siberia, a Muslim state founded in the wake of the dissolution of the Golden Horde, as part of a concerted effort to destroy the remaining Khanates of that horde. This fighting was inspired by the legendary Russian Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, who had sacked Kazan in 1551, followed by Astrakhan 6 years later, all with the goal of pushing Russia's borders further east. Ermak's incursion essentially represented the final piece in these expansion efforts, and as Russia would later discover, may have led to the most important battle during Ivan the Terrible's reign. Ermak continued to make his way through Siberia until he finally met Khan Kachum near the Irtysh River in October 1582. Khan Kachum was one of the last surviving heirs of Genghis Khan, and he controlled the territory stretching from the middle of the Urals all the way to the Ob River. 3 days of intense fighting followed this meeting, with Ermak eventually emerging victorious. The gates to Siberia were opened to Russia. Over time, a small network of towns and outposts spread deeper into Siberia. The arrival of merchants, such as the Stroganov family, followed the arrivals of traders and trappers who were quickly discovering that Siberia held one of the most important resources in 16th and 17th century Russian society: fur. The seemingly endless expanses of snow-covered Siberia contain many species of animals that were valued for their pelts, including the sable. The sheer abundance of such a valuable resource only drew more Russians into the territory, all hoping to become rich from the fur trade. Think of it as similar to the gold rush that took place in California between 1848 and 1855. Tempted by the prospect of riches, more and more Russians began to call Siberia their home. It's here where we start to see one of the main reasons why Siberia wants independence from Russia today: the swallowing up of Siberian resources. As the Russians started making their way deeper into western Siberia, they began subjugating the scattered villages they encountered. The Siberians tried to fight back, but they were quickly defeated by Russian troops, which had cannons and muskets that were far superior to anything the scattered Siberians could muster. That scattering was also a problem. It's estimated that there were only 100,000 people living in Siberia at the time, most of whom were divided into small groups of hunter-gatherers. It was impossible for them to put up a united defense against the Russians. With each victory, the Russians either forced or tempted their new subjects, using gifts of alcohol, metal utensils, and blankets into acting as guides and interpreters. Some even finally joined the Russian armed forces, attacking their neighbors to aid in the conquest. Finally, with their military dominance established, Russia started delivering terms to their new subjects. Submit to the Tsar's authority. It's here where furs come back into play. Each adult Siberian male who was subdued by the Russians was forced to deliver a specific number of furs and animal pelts annually as part of a tax named either Isaac or Yasak. While this was the official show of fealty to their new leader, most Siberian men were also forced to build fortifications and provide food to the encroaching Russian troops. As for the women, they were often enslaved to offer domestic services and sex to the Russians. This concept of Yasak deserves more exploration. The idea can actually be tracked back to the Mongols' Golden Horde, with the Russians adopting it following its conquest of Siberia. Here we see a quid pro quo relationship forming. Siberians delivered furs and pelts as part of their annual tax, but they were rewarded with the distribution of gifts from the Russian royalty. Yasak events were often accompanied by a large feast, during which time those paying their tribute of fur would receive products like tobacco, flints, and maces, along with other tools. Sometimes these events would lead to conflict. If the Yasak payers deemed the gifts they'd received to be unworthy, they would rebel against local leaders. In response to this, Russian Tsars and their officials spent several hundred years transforming the concept of Yasak from a gift exchange, though one heavily weighted in Russia's favor, into a straight-up levy. By the 1720s, Yasak had been transformed into a one-sided tax in the Volga Basin, with that tax spreading throughout the rest of Siberia in 1822. It would remain in place, forcing Siberians to pay their captures in furs from sables, martens, red foxes, beavers, and even cattle until the Russian Revolution of 1917. But what does all of this have to do with Siberia's desire for independence in 2024? Two things. First, it's clear that the subjugation of the Siberian people by Russia runs throughout the last 500 years of history. Those descended from the natives of that region that faced that initial conquest argue that independence is a must because Siberia should have never been under Russian control in the first place. Second, the fur taxes that Russia implemented during this time started a pattern of stripping Siberia of its natural resources for Russian gain. This pattern has continued into modern times, as you'll discover later, and it's the inspiration for many of the campaign phrases, especially "enough to feed Moscow," that were popular around the time of the online referendum mentioned at the beginning of the video. But for now, let's continue with our history lesson. Once the Russian Revolution ended the Tsarist era, much of Siberia was still uncharted. The Tsars simply didn't have the resources or the people to populate the vast swathes of empty land it had invaded. It was only upon the rise of the Soviet Union, which was a totalitarian state for which cost wasn't an issue, that Russia could finally complete its conquest of Siberia. And again, that conquest came down to resources. Under Joseph Stalin, Siberia was treated as a resource-rich land to be exploited and a penal colony for the many workers who were sent there. In 1929, Stalin created a labor camp system that existed as much to populate the territory as it did to extract resources from it. That camp was later named the Gulag. And over the next decade, around 2 million Russians, typically those who'd received prison sentences of 3 years or more, found themselves being shipped to Siberia for work on industrializing the land. They lay railroads, developed oil fields, and built infrastructure, all intending to extract yet more out of a land that had already been bled dry by the Tsars. Only now, the Russian appetite for resources had spread beyond fur and into oil, gold, and much more of what Siberia had to offer. The Gulag era ended upon Stalin's death. However, subsequent Russian leaders have built on the base that he created through prison and slave labor to further industrialize Siberia. All of this brings us to the modern day. Where Siberia was exploited for its fur during the rule of the Tsars, many in the country now argue that it's being exploited today for other resources. Take oil and gas as an example. The West Siberian Basin is home to the world's largest hydrocarbon basin. Surveys of the region have revealed that it holds enough oil to fill 146 billion barrels, along with 1,600 trillion cubic feet, or TCF, of gas reserves. Right now it contains 107 giant oil fields, 9 of which have been discovered since 2019, along with a mega giant and 10 supergiants, the term used to denote any field that can deliver 1 billion barrels of oil or more. Much like they did with the fur trade of the 1500s through to the early 1900s, Russia has established a way to make a ton of money from its ownership of Siberia. For context, the average price of a barrel of crude oil is estimated to be $80.12 in 2024, though this price will obviously fluctuate depending on demand. If Russia were able to extract all 146 billion barrels believed to be in the West Siberian basin alone, it would enjoy a windfall of around $11.7 trillion. The gas reserves in the basin offer even more value. In the gas trade, 6,000 cubic feet of gas is standardized to contain about the same amount of energy as a barrel of oil. This is called the barrel of oil equivalent, or BOE, with the BOE natural gas price standing at $18.45 at the time of the creation of this video. So let's do some math. 1,600 trillion divided by 6,000 gives us 266,666,666,667 BOE of gas. Multiply that by the BOE price, $18.45, and you get around $4.92 trillion. Siberia is a gold mine of oil and gas, with the values of those commodities in the West Siberian basin alone combining to around $16 trillion. And right now, Russia has control over those resources and the money that would come from them, which gives it massive political influence. Of course, there are obstacles in the way. Russia has to build the infrastructure to get to that gas and oil, so it's not going to get $16 trillion in pure profit, but it's still going to make trillions of dollars. Those are trillions that many in Siberia believe their territory should have. Beyond oil and gas, Siberia is also rich in gold and diamonds. According to mining technology, it, along with the Far East territory, is home to 84% of Russia's known gold reserves. Just one of the territory's gold deposits, the Shukoy Log deposit, is believed to house 40 million troy ounces of gold. A single troy ounce is worth around $2,000 at the time of the writing of this video, meaning the Shukoy Log deposit alone could add $80 billion to Russian coffers. What about diamonds? The figures are a little more difficult to come across for this natural resource. However, Russia is the world's largest diamond producer, and in 2019, Business Insider published an article in which one of its correspondents toured a Siberian diamond mine, the Bochebinskaya open pit, which produced 1.4 million carats of diamonds in 2018 alone. Yet more money going straight into the Russian coffers. And herein we see one of the major issues that Siberia's separatists have. They're living on some of the most resource-rich land on Earth, and they're not able to benefit from it. Russia holds all of the strings. It brings the industrialization needed to mine and extract all of these resources, and it controls what happens and who they're sold to once it has them. Siberia just has to accept the fact that it's getting bled dry, and its people have no choice but to let it happen because the territory is under Russian control. If the territory were its own country, it would be one of the richest per capita on the planet. And the craziest aspect of all of this is that the oil, gas, gold, and diamond reserves we've covered aren't all that are in Siberia. There's a lot more just waiting to be mined or extracted. And we haven't even mentioned the massive coal and iron reserves that are also being taken out of Siberia every day. Is it any wonder that Siberia's people feel hard done by? They're not getting rich off the land in which they live. According to Statista, the average monthly income for somebody living in Russia's Siberian Federal District was just 35,386 rubles per month. That's around $383 per month, adding up to just under $4,600 per year. The people actually living in Russia's most resource-rich territory are far from rich themselves. In fact, they're some of the poorest in Russia. According to Reuters, the average Russian earns 71,419 rubles per year as of October 2023, which is around double that earned by the average person in the Siberian Federal District. And even that wage isn't enough to cover the basics, according to many Russians. Perhaps some in Siberia feel the region still hasn't emerged from the days when it was paying taxes in fur or being treated as a labor camp during the Gulag era. Only now the true value of the land is known, and many Siberian people want to have the power to choose what to do with the resources in their land rather than giving it all over to Moscow. Now, if resources alone were the reasons why so many Siberians wanted independence, they'd still be able to make a convincing argument. But there's more. Many in Siberia believe that its people are being unfairly targeted for the draft into Russia's war against Ukraine. In September 2022, around 7 months after his initial invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization of the Russian army. The order was made into an official decree on September 21st, with the mobilization essentially acting as Putin's way of saying that Russia's vast swathes of reservist troops were going to be drafted onto the front lines. In eastern Siberia, some 3,500 miles away from Moscow, the announcement came as a very unwelcome blow. In the mountainous Republic of Buryatia, which is part of Siberia, military recruiters were soon knocking on doors to force people into the Russian army. Schools were transformed into conscription centers, with Alexandra Gamazapova, the president of the Free Buryatia Foundation, calling the announcement one of the most terrible nights in Buryatia's history. And for good reason. According to Foreign Policy, most of the recruitment efforts centered on ethnic Buryats, who make up about 30% of the nearly 1 million people who call the region home. Many men resorted to hiding in remote regions and forests to avoid the draft. Some even fled the country, with massive queues being reported at Buryatia's borders. But even those who escaped may not have found respite for long. In Yakutia, another republic, this time in northeastern Siberia, reports emerged of men being recruited from the region's many small towns and villages. Local media suggested that up to 4,500 men would find themselves on the front line of the conflict. In Dagestan, Foreign Policy reports, men were seen arguing with those who tried to claim they would be fighting for their children's future. "We don't even have a present," shouted one man. "What kind of future are you talking about?" It would appear that the only future they, along with many living in Siberia and Russia's other far-flung republics have, is a future in which they must accept an extremely discriminatory draft. That's the opinion of Inkstick, which reports that Putin's partial mobilization disproportionately targeted Russia's ethnic minorities. Those included the previously mentioned Buryats, as well as the Tatars, a Turkic group that descends from the Mongols' Golden Horde, and the Kalmyks, another Mongolian ethnic group. According to Inkstick, the draft depopulated many non-Slavic villages, those descended from the Mongols and Muslims, by up to 20%. And it's not just disproportionate drafting that's a problem for many Siberians. Many believe that they're also being used as cannon fodder in Russia's war on Ukraine. Let's come back to the Buryats as an example. According to Foreign Policy, research shows that the number of battlefield deaths among troops who came from the Buryatia region of Siberia is an enormous 13 times higher than those involving troops from Moscow. That's a strong indicator that Russia is singling out its minority groups for frontline and more dangerous duties, especially when you consider the fact that Moscow's population is at least 12 times the size of Buryatia. If troop deployment was fair, you'd expect 12 deaths for Moscow to every one from Buryatia. Instead, we're seeing the opposite. The numbers get worse when you dig deeper. The BBC also investigated battlefield losses during the conflict. It found that of the Russian troops confirmed to have died in the conflict from the beginning of September 2022, Buryatia and another Siberian region, Krasnodar, had over 200 deaths each. As for Moscow, just 15. This picture becomes clearer. Russia is using troops from Siberian regions in disproportionately dangerous situations, resulting in far more ethnic Siberians dying in a war that many don't want to fight in the first place. A quote from Mongolia's president Taskiagin El-Bagdori sums the situation up. The Buryat Mongols, Tuva Mongols, and Kalmyk Mongols have suffered a lot. They have been used as nothing more than cannon fodder, and that use is yet another reason that Siberians want independence from Russia. Not only are there historical tensions at play, along with the resource plundering, but research shows that they're more likely to die on the front lines of Russia's war. A war they wouldn't be a part of if they were independent. Then there's the China problem. You may remember at the beginning of the video that we mentioned China was one of the first countries to expand into Siberia during the Qin dynasty. Though he's never said so publicly, it's possible that Xi Jinping, China's president, believes that Siberia is Chinese territory based on this ancient ownership. And his case could be bolstered by the fact that Siberia is Asian rather than European, and that many of its ethnic groups don't trace their histories back to Russia. The idea of a Chinese takeover of Siberia may seem crazy to some, but consider the situation if Russia ultimately fails to annex Ukraine. Severely weakened, as well as humiliated on the global stage, Putin may see confidence in his regime disappear. Xi, on the other hand, could see an opportunity. What better time to launch his own campaign to claim Siberia and the many riches that its land holds than when Putin is licking his wounds, or better yet for Xi, has been removed from the picture due to his failure. Of course, this situation is purely speculative, but it feeds into the main argument for why Russian Siberia wants independence. Its people wish to control their destiny. Seceding from Russia would mean that the territory no longer has to deliver resources worth billions of dollars to their Moscow masters. They would be free to negotiate new deals, perhaps with Western countries, and may even benefit from the protection these countries could provide in return for their resources. One thing is for sure, the calls for independence in Siberia aren't going away. If the online poll that opened this video is any indication, most in the territory wish to be independent to the point when they're willing to break Russian law to express that desire. Add in the potential for becoming an extremely rich state thanks to Siberia's abundance of resources, as well as no longer being used as cannon fodder by a country that appears to treat Siberia's ethnic groups as second-class citizens, and you have a persuasive set of arguments that Siberians are latching onto. Of course, the desire for independence doesn't mean that it will ever come, and that's why we want to hear from you. Do you think Siberia should be independent from Russia? Do you think it's even possible given Moscow's hold over the region? Or do you think any play for independence would just turn Siberia into a pawn on the global geopolitical stage? Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.
The United States has plenty of enemies. That should come as no surprise given the country's position in the world. Even with the rise of China over the last 2 decades, the US is still seen by most as the world's most powerful country. And with that power comes influence. From its alliances with NATO and various countries in the Indo-Pacific region to setting up dozens of military bases around the world, the US takes great strides to ensure that its influence isn't just maintained, but actively felt by other countries. And that creates problems. Specifically, countries like China and Russia could be said to have anti-West agendas, and especially anti-America agendas, because they envy America having that top seat at the geopolitical table. That's an opinion shared by many in the US, at least according to a Gallup poll conducted in 2016, which asked Americans to name who they believed were their country's top enemies. North Korea topped the list 8 years ago with 16% of the vote, though Russia was a close second with 15%. Iran and China, receiving 14% and 11% respectively, were also identified as potential enemies, showing that the American people believe that if a threat were to come to the country's mainland, it would come from one of those countries. But there's bad news for America's enemies. No matter how much they hate the United States and would want to see it lose its influence over the rest of the world, the fact is that it's practically impossible for them to do anything about it. A military invasion would be incredibly difficult for many reasons, all of which we're going to cover in this video. So why will America's enemies hate this video? We'll start with the one thing that makes the world go round: money. The United States has a lot of it, and it spends more of its money on its military than any other nation in the world. In 2024, the United States approved a budget of $883.7 billion for national defense spending. The majority of this spending goes directly to the military, with $841.4 billion going to the Department of Defense. A further $32.4 billion is dedicated to the Department of Energy, which will use the money to fund national security programs designed to protect America's energy initiatives. As for the rest, it goes toward general defense-related activities, both inside and outside of the National Defense Authorization Act's jurisdiction. That's a lot of money. However, the sheer scale of America's military spending is best viewed through the lens of the countries that might consider starting a war with the US. In 2023, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation examined America's defense spending in the context of the top 10 military spenders on the planet. Not only did it find that the US topped the list at the time of the investigation, spending almost 3 times more than the second biggest spender in China, but it also found that the US spends more than the next 9 highest spenders combined. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and Ukraine combined spend $849 billion at the time of the Foundation's report. By contrast, the US spent $877 billion, $28 billion more on its own. That massive spending manifests in the world's strongest military. That's according to Global Firepower, which ranks the US first in its 2024 rankings of over 140 military nations. using its power index metric, which considers a score of 0.0000 to denote a perfect military. Global firepower determined that the US has a score of 0.0699. Financially, it has the highest budget, as already mentioned, and the second highest purchasing power parity. Its overall military is third in the world in terms of sheer manpower, though it makes up for that slight shortfall by having more people in its air force and navy than any other country. Then there's the equipment. More aircraft than any other nation, with a stock of 13,309, makes the US dangerous against any foe in the air. And though its navy is only the fourth largest in the world in terms of sheer numbers of boats, it makes its spending count in terms of water displacement and investment into the powerful vessels that win naval wars in the modern age. America has 11 aircraft carriers, 9 helicopter carriers, 75 destroyers, making it the world leader in those three categories. Add to that the second largest submarine fleet, which some would argue is actually the strongest fleet thanks to most of those submarines being nuclear-powered, and the US represents a formidable foe to even its strongest enemies in terms of pure military might. But the size and strength of America's military is far from the only problem that the US poses to a potential enemy invader. Its geography also offers major advantages. To the east and west of the United States lie two massive coasts. Add Alaska into the mix, and you have another massive coast that's a little separated from the American mainland. Combined, those coasts add up to 12,386 miles, with the west coast accounting for 1,293 miles, while the east and southern coasts, the latter linking into the former, combine for a total of around 3,700 miles. On the surface, that would make it seem that the US is primed for a coastal invasion. However, that's never happened for two reasons: the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. On either side of the US lie two massive oceans that separate it by thousands of miles from the majority of its enemies. Not only does the US patrol those oceans with its massive navy, ensuring it can intercept threats as they occur, which would give troops on the mainland more than enough time to prepare for a coastal invasion, but it also monitors those oceans. If a Chinese aircraft carrier starts sailing across the Pacific, the US is going to spot it long before it ever reaches a range close enough to send jets over the mainland. The same goes for an invasion from the east. Not only would the United States see it coming, but it would also have information coming from its European allies in NATO, more on them later, to help it get ahead of any attack from the Atlantic. All of this adds up to the US being practically impossible to invade via an amphibious assault. There's just too much distance involved. America would see it all coming long before it was under threat, thanks to the sheer power of its navy, would counterattack with devastating force to prevent an enemy like China or Russia from establishing any entry point via the coast. History backs up this assertion. The United States was a major player in World War I and World War II. Barring the attack on Pearl Harbor, which officially brought the United States into World War II, it faced no invasion on its own soil. While the rest of Europe was being blanketed by bombs dropped from Luftwaffe planes during World War II, the US was safe from attack because it wasn't possible for Nazi Germany to get those planes over to the American mainland. Likewise, when Germany was using U-boats to terrorize the oceans during World War I, America was still safe because those boats weren't capable of landing troops on its shores. Some historians even believe that the US allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, a theory called backdoor to war, as an excuse to allow it to enter the fighting in World War II. If that's true, then the only attack on American soil during that war was the one that US essentially approved itself. That debate is up in the air, and most historians don't believe the backdoor to war theory, but the difficulty of attacking the US via its coasts still exists today. Yes, planes can fly further and ships can sail in greater numbers, but the distance is still so large that it will be impossible to launch an assault without being spotted and countered. This spells trouble for those who stand against America. Still, perhaps it means a land-based invasion is possible. That's almost as unlikely as a naval invasion. After all, the US maintains very strong relationships with Canada, its neighbor to the north, and Mexico to the south. Even when those relationships are occasionally strained, they have never come close to the point where either would facilitate a full-scale invasion of the United States for one of its enemies. Doing so would not only make that nation an enemy itself, triggering retribution from a far more powerful military than Mexico or Canada could ever hope to muster, but it would violate the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Sometimes called the Neighbor Treaty, this agreement guarantees reciprocal trade and offers substantial economic benefits for all three nations involved. Benefits that Mexico and Canada wouldn't be willing to lose for the sake of supporting an invasion. But let's assume by some miracle that an American enemy manages to find a route to the mainland. Would it then have a clear shot at taking out America on home soil? Again, it seems unlikely. America has some of the world's most diverse geography wrapped up in its landmass. Thus, if the enemy came through Mexico, again hypothetically speaking, it would be forced to head for Texas or California. Both are exceptionally well defended. The US maintains nearly 50 military bases in those two states alone, 15 in Texas and 32 in California, that are home to thousands of troops alongside all of the equipment those troops need to act as a first line of defense against an invasion from the south. There would be no need to ship equipment to these regions to fight against the enemy threat. They'd be ready and waiting, taking advantage of their ability to funnel the enemy into strike zones, thanks to the southwestern desert regions, preventing incursion while avoiding California and Texas. Those bases would only need to hold the line as America sends more troops in support, creating a bottleneck in the south through which enemy forces are unlikely to get much further. Look elsewhere in the US and you see further geographical advantages. The mountainous regions to the west would offer a similar filtering effect to the deserts in the southwest. The Pacific mountain system stretches some 4,500 miles, running from Canada to Mexico, which causes severe problems for troops landing via the Pacific. Add to all of this America's sheer size, with vast plains and deserts lacking cover and leaving opposing forces vulnerable to America's massive firepower, and you have geography that seems tailor-made for protecting against an invasion. Okay, you might think, maybe the enemy won't try to invade directly. Instead, what if it manages to cut off the resources flowing into the United States, essentially starving its people out and ruining its war machine to the point of submission? That isn't likely to happen either. Let's look at food first. The United States is already very close to being 100% self-sufficient when it comes to food. Only 15% of its supplies come from overseas. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, also points out that about a third of the country's fresh vegetables, along with 55% of its fruit and 94% of its seafood, come from overseas. But it's that 15% figure that's the headline, because it means the US already produces 85% of its own food. Now combine that with the fact that the US exports around $170 billion of food annually. Should an enemy nation somehow create a blockade that prevents food from getting in or out, the US is already most of the way to being self-sufficient and would actually have more food due to its exports no longer shipping out. Furthermore, focusing on fixing the issue of land abandonment could be a massive boon for the United States. According to Yale University, the US lost 98,000 square miles of farmland to abandonment between 1997 and 2018. Reactivating just a small portion of that land would lead to even more food being produced, an action that would certainly be possible were the US forced to direct resources toward more food production. And this is all just to sustain levels and varieties of food that the US has right now. If push came to shove, America could focus on the basics alone, producing food in such high volumes that it would be impossible to literally starve its citizens out. What about military equipment? America is a long way ahead of the game there too. Though the United States military doesn't make its own equipment, it relies on scores of privately owned companies to build that equipment for it. Most of those companies are in the United States itself, meaning the US never finds itself in a position where it has to import vast quantities of equipment to keep its military running. Why would it? The country's private manufacturers already make the best equipment in the world, or close to, in the few cases where China or Russia might be superior, and this is evidenced by military equipment import figures. Trading Economics says that the US spent $214.36 million on military equipment imports in January 2024. Multiply that number by 12 to get an annual expenditure and you land on $2.572 billion, approximately 0.25% of the country's defense budget. That tiny expenditure tells you all you need to know about how reliant the United States is on other countries for its military technology. Simply put, it isn't. The American war machine can keep churning out equipment in-house via private contractors, with an enemy being unable to stop it via invasion for all the reasons we've already mentioned. So cutting the US off from its weapons isn't an option, but what about energy? Therein lies some potential for America's enemies. According to the US Energy Information Administration, or EIA, the US imports 8.51 million barrels of petroleum per day from other countries. It used about 20.01 million barrels per day back in 2022, which means we can estimate that it's importing around 40% of the petroleum it uses. But it doesn't need to. According to the EIA, the US actually exports more petroleum daily than it imports, at a rate of 10.15 million barrels. If an enemy tried to cut off America from its oil, it could simply stop exporting to amass the reserves it needs to keep its war machine churning. We see a similar situation with natural gas. During the first half of 2023, America's natural gas exports averaged 20.4 billion cubic feet per day. By contrast, 2022 saw it import 3.02 trillion cubic feet of gas. Divided by 365 to give us a daily figure, that amounts to about 8.27 billion cubic feet of gas bought from other countries. In that same year, the US consumed 32.21 trillion cubic feet of gas, meaning its imports account for less than a tenth of its total gas usage. The rest is sourced in the country itself, with the option of halting exports to make up a shortfall being available if its imported gas was cut off. It also has reserves. It had 625.4 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves by the end of 2021, with 44.4 billion barrels of oil during the same period. It even has a lot of coal ready to go if it needs to fall back on other energy resources, with 470 billion short tons of that resource available as of January 2022. That's not accounting for all the oil, gas, and coal that is yet to be drilled or mined out of the United States. Energy simply isn't going to be a problem because the US can be as self-sustaining as it is with food and military equipment. And with that, you have the three main resources needed to drive a war effort, none of which America's enemies can touch without invading the mainland, a feat that's already practically impossible. Add to all of this the fact that America has a strikingly small population compared to its sheer size. Its population is around 341 million people, spread across around 3.8 million square miles, whereas China, one of its potential enemies, has a population of 1.42 billion spread across 3.7 million square miles. If one of those countries is going to run out of resources, it's a safe bet that it'll be China long before the United States. So the US is more than capable of supplying itself in a time of war, with no reliance on outside countries. But what about getting those supplies to its military and people? It's at the top of the game in that area too. For instance, America's entire interstate system was designed on the back of a military operation. In 1919, Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to serve as an observer for the first transcontinental motor convoy. This convoy was essentially a road test for the military vehicles of the era, with the journey including 79 vehicles and stretching 3,200 miles between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. Through these observations, Eisenhower, who later became America's president, saw that the US needed an interconnected network of roads and bridges large enough to accommodate such vehicle processions. The unpaved roads, narrow passages, and rickety bridges of the era wouldn't do the job. His key observation was that higher-grade roads led to more success for the convoy. Around 35 years later, Eisenhower created the National Highway Program, assigning $50 billion to the program over 10 years. He aimed to build a vast network of interconnected highways. Now it would be a misnomer to claim that America's highways were built solely for military purposes. Eisenhower himself highlighted the 36,000 traffic fatalities, with those deaths having a massive effect on America's economy, as his chief reason for building the highways when passing the program through Congress. Still, the result was beneficial to America's military. It now had a massive network of large roads connecting every state in the Union. Those roads are invaluable for transporting goods, cargo, and military equipment. And it's not just roads that the US military can use to move equipment and troops around the country. The country's freight rail network spans 140,000 miles, connecting the states in much the same way as the highway system. If by some miracle an invading country manages to destroy a highway, this assumes the enemy even gets into the United States at all, the freight rail network offers a powerful alternative, as well as complementing the highway system. The US also has large rivers, which have historically proven important for transporting equipment during times of war. That's according to the US Naval Institute, which points out that World War II saw America regularly transporting steel and machinery for its war industry via the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois rivers. Those rivers also proved invaluable when building naval vessels during the war. 3,943 ships were built inland using the river's waters between January 1942 and September 1945, with those ships then using America's river networks to make their way to sea. So again, an enemy would have to get far enough inland to attack and take these rivers, or else it would leave the United States free to use them to strengthen its navy. This trio of options the US has for transporting equipment and troops across state lines would also prove vital when any war on American soil inevitably ends up in an urban warfare situation. The US has no reason to engage its enemies in battles on wide-open plains. It can simply pepper them with aerial assaults, whittling down numbers and forcing the enemy to engage within built-up cities. Each of those cities could easily be fortified, with America's logistical network being used to transport tanks, artillery and troops to force an invader to lose even more of its resources by getting bogged down in city-based battles. We've seen Ukraine use this tactic to great effect against Russia, with the latter having lost 442,880 of its troops because it has to constantly bombard fortified positions, and it's a tactic that would serve the US even better thanks to its logistical network and the sheer volume of military equipment it has. Then there are America's alliances. If we consider the United States as the closest thing the world has to an empire in the 21st century, we can consider how its approach to building that empire has been far different from the approaches seen in the past. Every empire of old built itself up in the same way, conquering territory to expand its influence. The United States has taken a different approach, instead building alliances with dozens of other countries while still positioning itself as the world's dominant military force. Why is that bad news for America's enemies? Those alliances would come to bear if the US was ever attacked on its own soil, and chief among those alliances is NATO, a collective of 32 countries, including the United States, that come together to handle global security issues. Each member of NATO agrees to Article 5 of the organization's charter, which states that if any NATO ally is subject to an armed attack, every other member of the organization will consider this as tantamount to an armed attack against themselves and will act accordingly. In other words, an attack on American soil wouldn't just be an attack on the United States. It would bring 31 other nations to the fight, each doing whatever it deemed necessary to support the US. That support could come in the way of troops and equipment being shuttled over to America to help defend it against an invading force. However, NATO could also make its strength known in other ways. For instance, let's assume that Russia is the attacking force. Given that most of NATO's members are in Europe, it's not outside the realms of possibility that they would attack Russia at home, making it more difficult for Vladimir Putin to keep his troops inside the United States supplied. Russia would be forced to fight a war on multiple fronts, a war that includes the world's strongest military nation. The US has other alliances too. We mentioned its close relationships with Canada and Mexico earlier, with those relationships being key to preventing a land-based invasion against the US. However, America also maintains strong relationships with several partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Its trilateral agreement with Japan and South Korea, in addition to a similar agreement it has with the UK and Australia, would serve as an early warning system. If a country tries to invade via the Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and Australia could all alert the US. The same goes for the Atlantic. The UK would see an attack from that direction coming. Add to all of this the fact that the US has around 750 military bases spread across 80 countries, and you have even more allegiances built up. Even the countries hosting those bases that might not participate directly on America's side in a war still have reason to support it, because losing the US means they lose military advantages that these bases provide. Now let's return to American soil. We've already established the reasons why the US is a nightmare to fight at home. The country's geography limits invasion points, giving America a chance to create choke points and funnel an invading army wherever it's most tactically advantageous to the United States. The country is self-sustaining, meaning it can't be cut off from supplies, and its vast logistical network means it can send troops and equipment anywhere they're needed. But there's something else the US has at home that could prove dangerous to its enemies. Its civilians. America's civilians are the most heavily armed in the world. According to Bloomberg, the country has 120.5 firearms for every 100 residents, making it the only country that has more guns than people. That could be a double-edged sword for the US. On one hand, a well-armed population is one that could fight alongside America's already powerful military. Urban warfare becomes a lot harder for an invading force when it might have to deal with civilians taking potshots, or even joining up with the military to fortify and defend cities alongside an army. But on the other hand, this proliferation of guns could also serve an enemy if it took a city, as it would have ready-made supplies it could give to ground troops so they could take the fighting elsewhere. Of course, the real question is, would America's civilians stay and fight at all? Interestingly, we have some statistics that suggest at least a large portion of them might. In October 2023, the Daily Mail reported on a study conducted by Quinnipiac University. The institution quizzed 1,374 American adults on what they would do should the country ever face an invasion by Russia that was similar to the one that we're seeing in Ukraine. Around 55% of the respondents said they would stay and fight to defend their country, while 38% said they would flee. If we assume that the 55% figure is accurate and we discount children from America's population, we can stack it against the 258.3 million adults the Census Bureau recorded in the United States in 2020. The result is a powerful force, 142,065,000 adults who claim they would fight to defend their country if an enemy ever invaded. Of course, how many of the 55% who say they'd stay and fight are telling the truth versus those who are all words and no action should the time come would only be discovered if the US was attacked. But an American enemy would be unwise to discount the civilian factor when trying to figure out how to topple its opponent. The desire to protect themselves and their land could prove just as dangerous as facing the full force of the American military. Combine all of these factors and you have the reasons why America's enemies will hate this video. It reveals that no matter how much they may want to topple the United States, they simply won't be able to defeat America on its own soil. But perhaps they won't have to, sowing seeds of discontent within the country, as Russia is believed to have done with the repeated interference via hacking and the dissemination of fake news during the 2016 election, may prove a far more powerful tool than attacking the US directly. Their solution may not be war. It may be to create such powerful divides within the US that the country ends up taking itself down. But what do you think? Do you see any weak point in the American defenses that the enemy could exploit to attempt an invasion? Which enemy, if any, do you think might try to go to war with the United States in the future? Tell us what you think below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out if the US and China go to war, who loses, hour by hour. Or click this other video instead. In the early days of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, the nation was almost a satellite state, overshadowed by the might of the Soviet Union. So much so that Mao Zedong, whom China revered as a fearless leader, was treated as nothing more than a puppet on Joseph Stalin's string, a humiliated figure relegated to the sidelines during his visit to Moscow in 1949. But if there's one thing that China is hell-bent on achieving, it's correcting historical humiliations and regaining its rightful place on the world stage. In the case of the Soviet Union, or now Russia, China had to wait some 70 years for the tables to turn. But boy did they turn. Now China holds the better cards in the Moscow-Beijing relationship. The country that was once China's domineering overlord has now become its lapdog, eager to please and gain favor. But how did this happen? How did the power dynamic between Beijing and Moscow shift so drastically? Stick around and you'll find out. But to understand just how drastic this power dynamic switch has been, we must first travel back in time to the previously mentioned early days of the People's Republic of China. The PRC was founded in October 1949. Just 2 months later, Mao traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin, then the leader of the Soviet Union. This meeting was crucial for the newly established People's Republic of China, as it sought recognition and support from the Soviet Union, a major world power and the leader of the communist bloc. Now, judging by the hearty military march performed in Mao's honor on this occasion, he had nothing to worry about. After all, the opening line of Moskva-Peking, or Moscow-Beijing, a song written to celebrate China and Russia's relationship, loudly proclaimed that Russians and Chinese are brothers forever. Yet Stalin did not treat Mao as a brother. He treated him as a subordinate. For starters, he didn't even welcome him immediately. Instead, Stalin shipped Mao off to his snowbound seasonal home, located 17 miles outside of Moscow. There, he couldn't do anything but wait for Stalin while complaining about virtually everything, from the quality of the fish he was served to the discomfort of the mattress he slept on. Weeks later, when Stalin finally granted Mao an audience, he had little interest in Mao's ideas and plans for China. Instead, Stalin focused on asserting Soviet dominance and reportedly even lecturing Mao on Marxist theory. He then strong-armed his way into a highly advantageous arms deal that had China borrowing money from the Soviet Union to purchase the country's weapons. Worst of all, the borrowed money was to be paid back with hefty interest. This first meeting undoubtedly set the tone for the relationship between these two countries and their leaders for years. While Stalin was alive, he was the teacher, the titan of the communist movement, as one author puts it. Naturally, this made Mao nothing more than his student. Though to be fair, Mao did learn a thing or two from Stalin. He copied many of the Soviet leaders' ruthless tactics, consolidating his power through purges, propaganda, and authoritarian control. These two leaders had another thing in common: an ever-growing disdain for the West. That's also what kept Russia and China together throughout history, despite all their differences and conflicts. One of these differences lies in how these nations continued growing and developing after their initial alignment. China has undoubtedly done a superior job of building its economy and becoming a global powerhouse. Russia, on the other hand, hasn't, not even close. The country pursued an empire-building foreign policy that only managed to strain its resources and hinder its economic progress. Russia was no longer China's big brother, but rather a struggling neighbor, unable to match China's economic influence. But don't get it twisted, Russia was still a force to be reckoned with, far from being anyone's pet. So what brought Russia to its knees before China, transforming it into a mere shadow of its former self? The answer is simple: the war in Ukraine. After mercilessly invading Ukraine, Russia was shunned by much of the Western world. In fact, having faced a barrage of sanctions, harsh criticism in international media, and exclusion from global cultural events, it appeared Russia was all alone. But it wasn't. It still had one powerful ally left: China. Of course, this allyship would come to cost Russian President Vladimir Putin quite a lot, more than just his wounded pride. You see, Russia has become significantly dependent on China's economic, political, and technological support. In other words, China has now become the dominant partner in the relationship. The student has become the master. Let's see how Russia's dependency on China materialized. First up, Russian exports. Just a few short years ago, Russia was a major exporter of oil and gas to Europe. We're talking about a total energy export of over $150 billion. Germany alone imported about 15% of the total figure. That's roughly $23 billion in crude oil, gasoline, and diesel. However, after Putin made the disastrous decision to invade Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Europe soured. What followed were sanctions that included restrictions on energy imports. Naturally, these restrictions drilled a huge hole in Russia's budget, a hole that forced Russia to pivot its export focus to China. Now it's undeniable that China had previously sought new energy resources to fuel its rapid economic growth. However, with this new dynamic, something else fell into Beijing's lap: a massive leverage over Moscow. China was now in the position to decide how much it wanted to buy, thus holding the reins and exerting influence over Russia. For now, the country has been pretty generous in its dealings with Russia. We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. In 2022, crude oil imports to China reached 1.82 million barrels a day, a 42.5% increase from the 800,000 barrels Russia exported to this country in 2021. And that was just the beginning. In March 2024, this figure reached a staggering 2.55 million barrels per day, more than doubling the 2022 numbers. The fact that Russia almost exclusively counts on China to keep its oil imports afloat is bad enough. The fact that this oil is sold at a hefty discount from global benchmarks adds insult to injury. But it's not like Russia has a choice. The same can be said for Russian gas exports. China holds all the cards there as well. Shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia signed a deal with China, agreeing to boost its natural gas supply to the country. In 2020, China received only 4.1 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. With this new deal, the figure was to rise to 48 billion by 2025. Around the same time, Russia started planning the construction of the Power of Siberia 2, a new 1,865-mile-long pipeline that would further increase the capacity to supply natural gas to China and deepen Russia's economic ties to the country in the process. However, oil and gas aren't the only commodities driving Russia's dependence on China. The total trade turnover between the countries has been on a steady rise since 2022. For comparison's sake, this turnover was around $107 billion in 2018. In 2022, it was $190 billion. In 2023, it was around $240, a 26% jump. In 2024, this figure might grow by another 15%. Talk about a booming relationship. Another way Russia has bowed down to China was by embracing the country's official currency, the renminbi, in several areas. One of them is the stock exchange. The Chinese currency dethroned the US dollar to become the most traded foreign currency on the Moscow Stock Exchange, with roughly 42% of transactions now conducted in the renminbi. Another is Russia's reserve currency. According to some estimates, Russia's reserves were valued at over $600 billion before the invasion. Post-invasion, half of these reserves have been immobilized in the West. A huge chunk of them has also been used to support Kremlin's war effort. In this chaos, Russia's central bank had no choice but to turn to the renminbi as its reserve currency. By now, you can clearly see a pattern of behavior. Step 1. Russia has no other viable alternatives. Step 2. Russia turns to China. Step 3. China now has major leverage over Russia. It's precisely this 1-2-3 sequence of events that has turned Russia into China's pet. Though to be fair, Russia's reliance on the renminbi can also be explained as part of the rising de-dollarization movement. Russia was joined in this movement by BRIC's initial members, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, with the goal of reducing their dependency on the US dollar and ultimately diminishing Washington's economic influence. That's why Russia now uses the renminbi to settle 25% of its international trade and 75% of its dealings with China. But this doesn't change the fact that China now holds significant sway over Russia's economic decisions. The same applies to the country's military decisions. But how so? Well, the war in Ukraine has been wreaking havoc on Russia's defense capabilities. And who's been helping the country with this mess? You guessed it, China. China has been a tremendous support while Russia is ramping up its defense capabilities. So much so that Moscow is currently undertaking the most ambitious military manufacturing expansion since the Soviet era. But what exactly is China's role in all this? It's the same role China assumed for many countries worldwide. China is the supplier. As the leading supplier for the Russian military complex, China provides a significant chunk of components necessary for Russia's military production. This includes everything from machine tools to drone and turbojet engineers. It also includes nitrocellulose, which Russia's military uses to produce large quantities of artillery rounds. However, large might be an understatement, as Russia is on track to produce 3 times more artillery shells than the entire US and Europe are producing for Ukraine. Currently, the country is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month. If we crunch the numbers, this comes out to 3 million a year. Together, the US and Europe can only generate about 1.2 million artillery munitions to send to Ukraine. Russia is also dependent on China's microelectronics, which are used to power its advanced military systems. As many as 90% of these microelectronics were sourced from China in 2023. China is also supplying technology to Russia. After all, the country did spend years stealing Western technology through various means, so why not share the booty with its down-on-its-luck partner? Of course, China's President Xi Jinping isn't doing this from the goodness of his heart. Personal interest has fueled every single one of his actions, but more on that later. For now, let's focus on the other ways Russia has benefited from China militarily. So, China is helping Russia produce new weapons. However, it also sells sophisticated military equipment directly to Russia. However, there's an important caveat: no lethal weaponry. The US warned China against selling these types of weapons since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It seems that China has heeded these warnings so far, well, officially at least. After all, we are dealing with 2 of the world's most secretive countries here. But China is sticking to the no-lethal weaponry story, so let's give it the benefit of the doubt. In February 2024, the country reaffirmed this commitment when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. According to reports, he assured his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba, that Beijing isn't selling lethal weapons to Russia for its war against Ukraine. So what is China selling to Russia? Mostly military vehicles and drones. In the first year or so of the Ukrainian invasion, Russia purchased $32 million worth of Chinese drones from manufacturers like DJI Technology and Autel. In December 2023, Russia bought 500 Chinese Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles, or ATVs, manufactured by Shandong Odess Industry. Reportedly, these 500 units were added to Russia's existing lineup of about 500 basic models of this vehicle. It also plans to acquire 1,000 more of these ATVs. But the fact these aren't lethal weapons doesn't make China's dealings with Russia any less worrisome. After all, supplying components and technology for lethal weapons is almost as impactful, if not more so, in the long run. That's why the US has been taking steps to curb China's ability to supply such components to Russia. In December 2023, the US Department of Treasury sanctioned a network of entities and individuals based in China for their involvement in facilitating transactions of Chinese-manufactured weapons and technologies to Russia. The list of these sanctioned individuals and entities only keeps growing as Russia amps up its military production. Paradoxically, while supporting Russia's war effort directly and indirectly, China is also trying to assume the role of the peacemaker between the 2 countries. Initially, Xi's peace initiative consisted of 12 points aimed at de-escalating the conflict and finding a diplomatic solution. However, these points were vague at best and mostly served to promote China as a peace-loving global power. So it's no wonder this initiative was ill-received by both Ukraine and the West. The new 4-point peace plan from April 2024 doesn't look any more promising. According to China, this plan is no longer vague. Listen to the 4 mentioned principles and see whether you agree. Number 1. Focusing on peace and stability rather than selfish gains. Number 2. Cooling down the situation in Ukraine rather than adding fuel to the fire. Number 3. Establishing conditions for restoring peace rather than aggravating the situation. Number 4. Reducing the negative impact of the war on the world economy. Not exactly the Treaty of Versailles, is it? Both plans are nothing more than a clumsy way to show the world China can resolve a major conflict, Though let's be honest, these performative plans probably couldn't even resolve the conflict between two neighbors fighting over a fence. But China is probably content with how things currently stand. After all, the situation in Ukraine is what brought such a radical shift in the power dynamics between China and Russia. And let us tell you, China has gotten quite a few concessions in this ordeal. Arguably, one of the most significant concessions is access to the Arctic. You see, Russia is an Arctic nation, owning some 15,000 miles of the Arctic Ocean coastline. China, on the other hand, isn't. Well, at least territorially. In spirit, China pretty much considers itself an Arctic nation, or a near-Arctic nation, to be precise, which is what Xi proclaimed China to be in 2018. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia, which considers the Arctic its backyard, wasn't too happy about China trying to jump the fence. Though the sentiment might not have changed after the invasion, Russia no longer has the luxury of saying no to China's Arctic ambitions. After all, it was shunned there too, with the remaining Arctic nations refusing to cooperate with Russia in the Arctic Council. Let's review the 1-2-3 pattern. 1. Russia is completely isolated. 2. Russia turns to China. 3. China is now heavily involved in the Arctic development projects. Of course, after spending years trying to find an in, China welcomed this opportunity with open arms. With this opportunity also comes access to unprecedented mineral reserves, plentiful energy resources, and crucial maritime routes. Talk about striking gold. Another concession Russia made to China has to do with weapon exports to India. You see, China and India have had their fair share of bloody border disputes. On the Indian side, most of these disputes were fought with Russian weapons, as the country was the #1 arms importer for India for a long time. Beijing did try to get Moscow to cut arms sales to India during this period, but Moscow didn't want to hear it. After all, who is China to dictate who Russia can and can't sell weapons to? Well, the days of asking this prideful question are certainly gone. India has seemingly also taken the hint, slashing its arms procurement from Russia in more than half, much to China's satisfaction. This sentiment has undoubtedly spread to other areas of cooperation between Russia and China, since there's virtually no area where Russia hasn't made some sort of concession. For instance, in October 2023, Russia signed a nearly desperate grain agreement with China to contain Ukraine's exports to the country. The agreement is worth around $25.7 billion and obliges Russia to provide 70 million tons of grain, legumes, and oilseeds over 12 years. This and other humiliating one-sided concessions signal that Moscow is desperate to tether Beijing closer, doing anything it can to retain its favor. Well, for now, at least. But will Russia be able to handle this dynamic for long? Can Putin, a leader driven by unyielding pride, truly be content serving as a compliant puppet to China's strategic ambitions? You probably already know the answer to this question. Sure, Putin is currently in a tough bind. He must take everything he can from China, even if that means Russia is seen as the country's pet. After all, he sees the conflict in Ukraine as central to his fight to keep his regime and confront the US, so being China's pet is currently the lesser of two evils. But Putin has already demonstrated how much he's willing to sacrifice and let his people endure for the sake of neutralizing perceived threats to Russia's sovereignty, so it's highly unlikely Russia will submit to China forever. So despite many reports that Russia has sealed its fate as China's vassal, let's not jump to any conclusions, not when the dependence in this relationship isn't so one-sided, and not when dependence doesn't necessarily equal subservience for Russia. Remember, Russia is still the #1 nuclear power in the world. And it still boasts a rather resilient economy and some strategic advantages that allow it to maintain a degree of autonomy in its dealings with China. Let's break it down. It's undeniable that the war in Ukraine has crippled Russia's economy for a while, but 2 years after the invasion started, it seems that it bounced right back. In 2023, the Russian economy registered a robust growth rate of 3.6%, which came on the heels of a recession in 2022. But even 2022 wasn't as disastrous as predicted. Russia's economy was predicted to shrink by 12%, but only did so by 2.1%. This outcome even confounded the International Monetary Fund, which subsequently revised its forecast for 2024, predicting that the Russian economy might record a 2.6% growth. But how is this possible when several rounds of Western sanctions have been levied against the country? Russia has military spending to thank for this. Producing military equipment has kept the country's factories pretty busy, benefiting all industrial sectors. The revenue from oil and gas exports also helped. Now, you might ask, doesn't China have a hand in both of these areas? The answer is yes, but that's not the only contributing factor. The volume of Russian oil exports to India and a few other developing countries can be comparable to exports to China. Plus, just because China has a major share in Russia's trade doesn't make the country entirely economically dependent. Just take Australia as an example. China has a 26% share in Australia's foreign trade, more than Russia. Yet you don't see Australia making any long-term concessions to China. It's quite the contrary, really. Australia is actually a part of anti-China alliances like AUKUS, a security pact consisting of Australia, the UK and the US, whose aim is to contain China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. But let's go back to Russia's resilience. The situation is pretty much the same in the import department as it is in the export department. Countries like Turkey, India, and the United Arab Emirates have had no problems selling sanctioned goods to Russia, ensuring the necessary inflow of goods to the Russian market. Also, we did discuss the many concessions Russia made to China. However, there are many more Russia has refused to make. This includes joining China's flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to facilitate trade and investment flows across Asia. Russia also didn't recognize China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. It also refused to allow the relocation of polluting industries into its territory, or unilateral tariff restrictions, or even eliminate visa requirements for Chinese nationals. These moves, or lack thereof, suggest that Russia can still hold its own to some degree when it comes to China. But why isn't China pressing harder, considering Russia's precarious position? It's simple, really. China needs Russia too. After all, China can act as a global peacemaker all it wants, but the fact remains that virtually no other country sees it that way. Instead, most global powers, with the US at the helm, see China as a dangerous threat. And with a hostile US, a disillusioned Europe, and a wary Asia, China doesn't exactly have a surplus of friends on the global stage. So it needs Russia as a counterbalance if it's to achieve its goal of becoming a global and Asian rule setter. Plus, China can use Russia as a case of study of sorts. Let's explain. Beijing has long viewed Western sanctions against China as inevitable. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, the country now has a front-row seat to how these sanctions actually affect the economy of a major power. China gets to see which protective measures are effective and which are not, which methods of response work and which backfire. Then there's also the issue of battle-testing weaponry. You see, China hasn't been involved in an outright war for over 40 years. This means the nation had no chance to test its military equipment and strategies in a real-life scenario, especially against Western adversaries. Russia is doing just that in Ukraine. Since a huge chunk of these weapons has some ties to Russia, the war in Ukraine gives China the chance to see these weapons' durability, performance, and effectiveness in modern conflict against their Western counterparts. This also gives China a chance to gauge which Russian weapons to acquire next. But it's also worth mentioning that Russia's invasion of Ukraine also serves as a cautionary tale to China. As you probably know, China has similar ambitions in regards to Taiwan. However, if the country's military leadership ever thought an invasion of Taiwan would be a swift victory, the situation in Ukraine should probably give them cause to pause. After all, instead of demonstrating that one of the most powerful military forces in the world can easily subdue a smaller neighbor, the invasion of Ukraine showed that military might can crumble in the face of determined resistance. This unexpected outcome can also mean that China has gotten itself tangled with a losing team, and one that doesn't really like to lose at that. So it's going to be interesting to see what the future holds for both Russia and China. For now, we'll ask you, do you see the relationship between Russia and China as a mutually beneficial alliance? Or do you think Russia is currently nothing more than China's junior partner? If so, will the situation change? And when? Has Putin truly maneuvered his country to a dead end, or is there an out? Share all your predictions and opinions in the comment section below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out why China wants to attack Russia, or click this other video instead. It's March 2024, and teams of high school students from around Europe have descended on Italy to take part in the European Robotics Championship. The stakes are high. The best performers from this collection of students will punch their tickets to take part in the World Robotics Championships in Houston, Texas, a chance for these talented youngsters to get noticed and potentially go on to study in the United States. Lithuania sends 4 teams to participate. The Baltic state had already expressed its concerns with the championships because it allowed Russian teams to take part. They wrote in protest urging the event's organizers to ban the Russian students, only to find themselves roundly rejected. Still, they chose to take part. Why shouldn't they? This is their opportunity too, and they shouldn't refuse it simply because they would be competing against Russian students. Only they weren't competing. At least that was the case for two of the Lithuanian teams, Lituanica X and Litbot, that were told that to pass through to the World Championships, they would have to compete against other countries in alliance with the Russian teams. Those two Lithuanian teams refused. Instead, they raised their own nation's flag, along with the flag of Ukraine, at the competition to show their solidarity with Ukraine and their opposition to what they view as the Russian invasion of a country that should be independent. Lithuania's high schoolers bore a heavy cost for this act of protest. Despite the four teams being among the competition leaders, giving them a great chance to head to Houston, their refusal to work alongside Russia's robotics students led them to being docked points. Ultimately, they didn't qualify. But their refusal to work alongside Russia served as a microcosm of a trend that's been occurring since the war in Ukraine started: the DERUSIFIcation of the Baltic states. These three states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are roundly rejecting Russian influence across the board. And in this video, we're going to ask the key question: why? To find our answers, we first have to start with a history lesson. On June 15, 1940, France's initial resistance to its Nazi occupiers finally crumbled. France fell, opening the door for Adolf Hitler and his regime to launch an attack on Great Britain. Though that event triggered the darkest days in Europe for many countries that were involved in World War II, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet cronies saw an opportunity to consolidate power while also building up the Soviet Union's defenses against the Nazi forces. Stalin sent an ultimatum to Lithuania, one of the three Baltic states that border the Baltic Sea and, at the time, one of the countries that could provide Stalin with a clear path into Finland. Stalin wanted Finland. He had already concentrated attacks on the country in an effort to claim it as Soviet territory, leading to his ultimatum to Lithuania being a simple one. It must form a government that was acceptable to the Soviet Union, in addition to allowing as many troops as Stalin wanted to move through the country on their way to Finland. Antanas Smetona, the president of Lithuania, quickly fled the country, leading to the installation of a people's government that granted the Soviets their access. Over the next couple of days, Stalin issued similar ultimatums to Latvia and Estonia, with similar results in both countries. The turnaround in the Baltic states was rapid. The communist parties in each country, which were previously extremely small and held little influence over the Baltics, suddenly became the most powerful political forces in the three regions. As for the Soviets themselves, they set about working with these parties to create a new regime, ignoring the constitutions each of the three countries had in place as they assimilated Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union. Property became nationalized. Mass deportations began, primarily focused on women and children who were sent to the most inhospitable desert and Arctic regions in the Soviet Union. All told, Latvia and Lithuania lost 35,000 people to these deportations, but Estonia bore the worst of it. The country lost 60,000 people. Those deportations continued even as the Nazis came knocking on the Baltic states' collective doorstep. At first, many in the Baltics considered the Nazis to be their liberators. They hoped that Germany would force the Soviet Union out, allowing each state to re-establish independent governments while also returning nationalized properties to their original owners. That isn't what happened. Germany instead turned the Baltic region into a new territorial unit, which it dubbed Ostland, and began a campaign of Nazification. Baltic support for Germany disappeared, with the three countries spending the rest of the war being fought over by Germany and the Soviet Union. They were little more than pawns in a global war, and the ravages of that war were made clear when it finally ended. Lithuania lost 15% of its population to the fighting, Estonia lost 25%, and Latvia, the worst affected of the three, saw its population decline by 30%. Estimates place the total wartime and occupation deaths in the three countries during World War II at 520,000 people. The end of World War II brought no reprieve for the Baltic states. Rather than being granted their independence, each was made a Soviet republic, with Stalin working on integrating the three countries into the Soviet Union. Resistance movements existed, but they couldn't stop the march of Soviet industrialization. For the next 40 years, until the mid-1980s and the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Baltics were little more than states within the Soviet Union. Still, the 1980s brought change. Gorbachev attempted to reform the Soviet system during that decade, creating possibilities for the Baltic countries. Moscow's centralized power structure began to weaken, with mass movements such as the Lithuanian Movement for Reconstruction and the Popular Fronts of both Latvia and Estonia began fighting for change. They challenged the legality of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1989, prompting a huge demonstration that saw 500,000 people form a human chain linking Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to protest against the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 that had allowed the continued occupation by the Soviets in the first place. Finally, 1990 brought with it true change. All three countries held proper elections for the first time in decades, with all three voting in pro-independence parties. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia spent the 1990s establishing their independence once more. They formed new constitutions, created their own currencies, and started establishing relationships with other countries. The 2000s brought with them continuous economic growth, capped in 2004 when all three of the Baltic nations joined the European Union, or EU, and NATO. After around 60 years, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia could finally claim to be free of Russian oppression. Why does all of this matter? This history goes some way toward explaining why we're seeing what we're seeing in the Baltics right now, but it also explains the need for derussification in these states in the first place. Though they've been long free from the Soviet Union, all three countries still contain large Russian elements in various ways. But over the last 2 years, all three have started to reject those influences outright. We'll start with Lithuania, the home of the robotics teams that refused to collaborate with the Russian teams to win a competition that clearly meant a lot to them. Their single act of defiance is emblematic of a wider movement within Lithuania to rid the country of its Russian influences as much as possible. On a wider political level, Lithuania has been working to rid itself of Russian influence ever since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. For instance, Le Monde reported in April 2023 that Lithuania's parliament passed a series of amendments to its laws that placed extremely tight sanctions on any Russians who might attempt to claim citizenship in the country. Lasting for 1 year, those sanctions suspended applications for temporary resident permits and led to Lithuania outright refusing to accept any visa applications from Russian citizens except in the most exceptional of circumstances. Worse yet for prospective Russian immigrants, Lithuania's new laws also prevented them from buying property in the country for at least 1 year. So even those who make it into Lithuania may discover that they struggle to find somewhere to live. This isn't an example of Lithuania trying to remain neutral in a war that doesn't affect it. Instead, this vote was a clear message from the country that it supports Ukraine wholeheartedly. The immigration figures prove this, as Lithuania has accepted 75,000 Ukrainian refugees since the outbreak of war in February 2022, with 42,000 of those refugees having received temporary residence permits that will likely last for as long as the war continues. There's more. Beyond restricting Russian citizens' access to the country, Lithuania has also been working hard to weed out what it sees as risks to its national security. In August 2023, AP News reported that Lithuania declared a staggering 1,164 citizens of Russia and Belarus as threats to the country's security, with that declaration being accompanied by the stripping of permanent residencies of 1,164 individuals. The inclusion of Belarusian citizens in these numbers is also interesting. In fact, the announcement applies more to them than Russian citizens. 910 of the 1,164 are Belarusian, showing that Lithuania isn't just focusing on eliminating Russian influence from the country. It's also trying to rid itself of Russia's supporters. At the time of writing the script for this video, Lithuania is reaching the end of the initial year of sanctions mentioned earlier. The country's parliament is currently debating whether to extend the sanctions on citizenship and property ownership for a further year, having already rejected the restriction of free travel for Russians and Belarusians throughout Lithuania. Still, what we see here is a country that has drawn a clear line in the sand. Lithuania supports Ukraine. That much is obvious from the fact that the 128 members of the country's parliament united in declaring Russia's actions in Ukraine a genocide, essentially labeling Russia as a terrorist state in the process. It's also obvious from how ready Lithuania has been to welcome Ukrainian refugees, as well as from the level of financial and military support it's provided to Kyiv. In January 2024, Lithuania announced it would be sending a further $214 million to Ukraine, accounting for a little under a tenth of the country's entire military budget for 2024. Lithuania supports Ukraine so strongly that it's actively punishing Russians who attempt to move to the country. And it's not alone among the Baltic states, as we can see a similar opposition to Russian influence in Latvia. Like Lithuania, Latvia is imposing annual visa restrictions on Russian citizens who attempt to enter the country. It extended those restrictions in February 2024, with the country's foreign ministry announcing that Russians won't be allowed in the country until March 2025, unless they meet strict criteria. Those criteria include the ownership of an existing EU or Latvian residence permit, or that the Russian immigrant is a diplomatic staff member or the family of such a member. Latvia has also imposed sanctions against Russian citizens in the country, though it hasn't quite gone to the extent of Lithuania. For instance, April 2023 brought with it reports that the country implemented sanctions against 10 Russian people who were connected to the Kremlin's sentencing of a human rights defender named Vladimir Kara-Murza. Those 10 individuals received full travel bans, with Latvia's President Edgars Rinkēvičs going on to encourage the EU to place similar restrictions on the 10 people in question. Again, we see evidence of resistance against Russian influence throughout the country. And there's even more. In February 2024, Latvia became the first EU member state to impose a complete ban on agricultural products from Russia and Belarus. That appears to be a response to Russia essentially using the Baltic states' port infrastructure and grain storage capacity as a hub for its farming activity. Latvia clearly wants no part in helping Russian farmers profit from their products, with Latvia's decision meaning it will miss out on around 300 million euros of Russian imports annually until the ban is lifted. There's evidence that Latvia is trying to erase Russian culture from the country. Starting with the 2026-27 school year, Latvian schools will stop teaching Russian as a second language, with the schools instead asked to choose from one of the other official languages of the EU. So Latvia is in the DERUSIFYing game for the long term. By eradicating Russian in schools, it will create a whole generation of Latvians who don't speak the language and thus can't or won't work alongside the Russian population in the country. And that's a large population. About 25% of Latvia's population of 1.8 million are ethnic Russians, with the move to ban Russian from schools sending a clear message to those existing citizens: you aren't welcome and your culture is being phased out. Like Lithuania, Latvia has also come out in staunch support of Ukraine during the war. It joined its fellow Baltic nations in declaring President Vladimir Putin's invasion a genocide, again meaning that Latvia is essentially treating Russia as a terrorist state. And like Lithuania, Latvia regularly sends military and financial aid to Ukraine. January 2024 saw Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs announce a new military aid package that he said would include howitzers, 155mm ammunition, anti-tank weapons, rockets, grenades, helicopters, drones, communication devices, generators, as well as other equipment. That's a pretty strong commitment, made even stronger by Latvia's decision to commit 1% of its GDP to supporting Ukraine. So Russia is 0 for 2 in terms of engendering any sort of support for its special military operation from the Baltic states. And the situation doesn't get much better for Putin in the Kremlin when we turn our attention to Estonia. In September 2022, Estonia banned entry into the country for all Russian visa holders who wish to visit for purposes related to sports, tourism, culture, or simply to visit family and friends. It went a step even further. Russians aren't allowed to enter Estonia even if they're only passing through on their way to another country. These restrictions are also in place in Latvia and Lithuania, as well as Poland, adding to those countries' restrictions on Russian citizens claiming residence. The move cut off Russian access to the Schengen zone, which is the world's largest free travel region. Created through a joint effort by France, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, the zone hosts 420 million people from 27 countries, 23 of which are members of the EU. Now Russian citizens can't pass through that zone, regardless of their visa status or whether they have a passport, which further restricts Russian movement throughout Europe. All thanks to Estonia. We're also seeing similar steps to those Latvia is taking in terms of eliminating Russian culture from Estonia altogether. For instance, in 2023, Hype and Hyper interviewed Andrei Makarievich, a Russian professor who lives in Estonia, who highlighted several changes he's seen since the war with Ukraine began. These changes include Estonia ending the availability of Russian radio and television programs, essentially ostracizing the Russian members of its population from the mainstream entertainment sector. Makarichev also highlights how attitudes towards Russians have changed since February 2022. He points out that the Estonian Russian-speaking community was afraid to be accused of being Russians because, when they realized what Russia did with Ukraine, they just saw huge negative feelings about Russia that might be projected onto them. A strange in-between situation arose, according to Makarichev. Though many Russians in Estonia outwardly wanted to show that what Russia did had nothing to do with them, he claims many still support Russia's foreign policies behind closed doors. That leads to division, both between native Estonians and Russians, and within the Russian community living in Estonia. The derussification keeps coming. In February 2023, Estonia's government tabled a proposal to unfreeze about $21 million of Russian assets in the country so the money could be used to support Ukraine. And speaking of support, Estonia has been just as ready to send aid to Ukraine as Latvia and Lithuania throughout the war. Assuming it follows through on its plans, Estonia will have provided $1.29 billion in military and citizen aid to Ukraine by the end of 2027. Oh, and it's also joined Latvia and Lithuania in calling Russia's invasion a genocide. Russia can see all of this happening, and it isn't happy about it. In February 2024, it announced that it had placed several Baltic states' officials on a wanted list for destroying monuments to Soviet soldiers within their borders. These officials include Kaja Kallas, Estonia's prime minister, and the Lithuanian culture minister Simonas Kairys. However, this seems to be a hollow threat. Though Russia has called the vague notion of destroying monuments a crime against the memory of the world's liberators from Nazism and fascism, it hasn't mentioned what charges, if any, those on its wanted list would face. Furthermore, Russia has responded to the Baltic states' travel bans with bans of its own. March 24 saw the country deny entry to 347 Baltic citizens, many of whom are high-ranking officials, or were formerly officials, in their home countries, citing hostile policy as the reason. It's attempting to fight fire with fire. But the reality is that Moscow has to look at a trio of countries that are among the most vocal in the world when it comes to condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. The Baltic states are derussifying at a rapid pace, which brings us back to the question that opened this video. Why? The answer, at least partially, lies in the history the Baltic countries have with Russia. The memory of Soviet oppression is still fresh in the minds of many in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. It's only been 34 years since those countries were able to reclaim the independence that was taken away from them in the early 1940s, and there are still many in all three countries that can remember what life was like under Russian rule. Those scars are still fresh for many in the Baltic states. And it's the freshness of those scars that brings us to the main reason for derussification. None of the three want it to happen again. The Baltic states have been warning the rest of Europe about Russia and its intentions long before Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Sky News reports that 2 decades of warnings have gone ignored by NATO. The rest of Europe was more focused on the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan than they were on the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine in the 2000s and 2010s. This period also saw many countries in Europe, including Great Britain, reducing their stockpile of weapons that were seen as holdovers of the Cold War. Sky says that the UK in particular decommissioned tanks and reduced its stockpiles of ammo and artillery following the Soviet Union's collapse under the mistaken belief that the threat of a conventional war in Europe no longer existed. Even Russia's invasion and capture of Crimea, a precursor to the conflict we see now, didn't do enough to convince the rest of Europe that Putin presented a clear danger to Europe. All the while, the Baltic states were sounding alarms that were going unheard, resulting in the rest of Europe being shocked by Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. At least that's the opinion of Radosław Sikorski. As former Polish foreign minister, he spoke to Politico about the warnings that Poland and the Baltic states tried to issue to NATO over the 20 years before Russia's invasion. He notes that the nations to the east, those that border Russia or are close to it, ran into brick walls whenever they pled with NATO for increased troop deployments in their territory. Sikorski notes that they were all ignored when they started drawing attention to Russia's campaign of cyber attacks. Sometimes Sikorski took things further, such as when he compared the 2006 Nord Stream gas pipeline project between Russia and Germany to the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that divided his country between the Soviet Union and the Nazis. Sikorski may have gone a little too far with that comparison, but the sentiment was clear. Europe was ignoring the growing Russian threat. The Western Europeans pooh-poohed and patronized us for 30 years, he told Politico. They were patronizing us about our attitude. Oh, you know, you over-nervous, oversensitive Central Europeans are prejudiced against Russia. But perhaps that wasn't the case. Rather than Poland and the Baltics being prejudiced against Russia, they were instead issuing warnings because they understood Russia better than any other countries in Europe. All have been subject to the country's territorial claims, especially during the Soviet Union era, and perhaps they saw something in Putin's policies that nobody else did. Now they're in a position where they can say, "We told you so," to the rest of Europe and by extension NATO. And it's not like these warnings were unfounded. In 2007, Estonia's computer servers were hit with a massive distributed denial of service or DDoS attack that shut down private and public websites in the country. Estonia was essentially shut down for several weeks, with that shutdown leading to the deployment of around 1 million zombie computers that could help the attackers spy on Estonia's computing network. Estonia was convinced that Russia organized the attacks. But just as Sikorsky says, they were met with patronizing comments by the rest of Europe. That's according to Thomas Hendrik Ilves, Estonia's president at the time, who claims that the country's NATO allies told him that he didn't know what he was talking about and that he was simply being Russophobic. But the reality seems to be that these countries were seeing and reporting Russian warning shots, with their reports ultimately falling on deaf ears. It was only when Russia took the more direct action of invading an entire country that Europe and NATO started to pay attention. The Baltic states hope that both now have changed attitudes. That's because they see the risk that comes with a Russian victory in Ukraine. Should Putin succeed, they believe the odds are high that he's going to turn his attention to them. After all, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have all been Russian territory before. To the Baltic countries, their efforts to de-Russify send a clear message to Putin that they don't want anything to do with him, Russia, or his efforts to strengthen his own country. But they also send a message to the Baltic's allies. We warned you about this before. Do something about Russia now, or we, and the rest of Europe by extension, may face even bigger problems in the future. Pro-Russian parties in these three states are now practically obsolete. All three are determined to keep Russians out and showcase their support for Ukraine. To the Baltics, the results of the war in Ukraine doesn't solely affect Ukraine, it affects them, and if the result doesn't go their way, they could be next in Moscow's firing line. But what do you think about the Baltic states and their de-Russification? Is it a justified response to Russia's actions that not only signals the Baltic states' desire to stay independent, but also highlights how much of a threat Russia poses to the three countries it used to rule? Or are the Baltic states making a huge fuss about nothing, as NATO and the EU seem to believe before the Ukraine crisis, and that Putin will stop once he has Ukraine? Tell us your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia will lose Kaliningrad, or click this other video instead. Vladimir Putin's ambition to intimidate NATO with his Ukrainian invasion has spectacularly backfired. Far from sowing division and halting expansion, his actions have galvanized the alliance, boosting defense budgets across the board and ushering Finland and Sweden into the fold. How's that for unintended consequences? Previously, we explored Finland's contributions to NATO. Now it's time to delve into Sweden's dramatic journey into the alliance. Why is Sweden's NATO membership a strategic nightmare for Putin's grand designs? For one, Sweden is seriously considering developing a sixth-generation fighter jet, and despite its historically low level of military spending, its army is highly advanced. But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Stick around as we dive into all of the reasons Sweden terrifies Putin. Let's begin. Sweden formally applied for NATO membership alongside Finland in May 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For both countries, it was the end of a long tradition of military non-alignment. At the time, Vladimir Putin dismissed the new developments, saying that the two countries joining the alliance would not constitute a threat in itself. Rather, he said that he would only consider it a threat if they deployed a new military infrastructure in their territories. The latter came with a backhanded warning of a response in kind. Privately, though, Putin understood how deep of a blow this is to Russian power in Europe, and he must have been hoping that internal controversy would prevent them from joining. To admit a new member to the alliance, all NATO countries must be in agreement. Turkey stalled entry for Finland and Sweden, claiming that the two countries harbored members of Kurdish groups that it recognizes as terrorist organizations. Finland and Sweden's prohibition on arms exports to Turkey in response to its military operations in Syria in 2019 was also an item of complaint for the Turks. In the Turks' resistance, Vladimir Putin had a hope. Turkey is a purchaser of Russia's S-400 air defense system, which has earned it the ire of the United States. Turkey has also proven a vital lifeline for Russian energy exports and is now Moscow's fourth largest customer. Turkey has also gone through a period of democratic backsliding under Erdogan, who has been in power there in one form or another since 2003. Might the Turks prevent the two new countries from joining after all? Finland proved better able to overcome the Turks' objections, and it joined the alliance on April 4, 2023. Sweden, however, still saw its membership stalled, with Ankara claiming that Stockholm was being more intransigent about its concerns than Helsinki had been. At a summit in Madrid in July 2022, Sweden and Turkey agreed on renewed counter-terrorism cooperation both in and outside of NATO's framework, Additionally, NATO would establish a new office, the Special Coordinator for Counterterrorism. However, Turkey claimed that Sweden was dragging its feet on these commitments, particularly as the latter's courts blocked extraditions of individuals that it considered terrorists. Protests in Stockholm, where copies of the Quran were burned and Turkish President Erdogan was hanged in effigy, caused further diplomatic tension. Turkey said that this amounted to a hate crime, while the Swedes said it was an item of free expression. Then there was another obstacle. Hungary also objected to Sweden's NATO membership. Budapest's objections were not specific like Ankara's had been, but Stockholm's accusations about the supposed erosion of the rule of law under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was an item of dispute. The Hungarians denied this and claimed that Sweden's accusations made it a less than trustworthy partner. After complicated diplomatic maneuvering, where Sweden changed some of its domestic laws and relaxed rules over its arms sales to Turkey, the Turkish parliament finally voted to permit Sweden to join NATO in January 2024. Then on February 26th, the Hungarian parliament followed suit. The two countries signed an arms deal as part of this agreement. The agreement included Budapest's purchase of 4 Gripen fighter jets and expanded pre-existing logistics contracts. Vladimir Putin's last hopes had run out. Sweden's entry into the alliance became official when it submitted its instrument of accession to the United States government, which is NATO's depository as outlined in the North Atlantic Treaty. This occurred on March 7, 2024. Although NATO has frequently been criticized for adding members of questionable utility and exposing its members to security commitments that might undermine the collective defense principle enshrined in Article 5, Sweden is not such a case, and it adds a lot to the alliance. First, Sweden's entry into the alliance brings renewed geostrategic vulnerabilities for Putin. The fall of the Soviet Union severely constrained Russia's ability to influence the Baltic. Its current projections into the sea come only with the small enclaves around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Post-Soviet Russia's only choice in the face of this new reality was to heavily fortify Kaliningrad and use it as the center of an anti-access area denial strategy through a buildup of aircraft, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles. Through these, Russia hoped to undermine NATO movements in the Baltic and threaten the commerce of its member states. In effect, Russia attempted to do to the Baltic what China has attempted to do to the South China Sea through its island-building campaign. Sweden's entry into NATO is a grave threat to this post-Soviet strategy. It has the largest coastline of any Baltic nation, allowing for free access to and from the North Sea, making it a maritime transit hub that's much more difficult for Russia to disrupt. Sweden's island of Gotland in particular is a strategic area. It's a key pivot point in the Baltic and only 250 kilometers north of Kaliningrad. This is the perfect area for a forward military base, one that can threaten Kaliningrad and carefully observe Russian activity in the area. It's impossible for Russia to send troops and supplies between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad without transiting close to Gotland. In anticipation of its importance, Sweden is remilitarizing the island as part of its entry into NATO. It's only a matter of time before Stockholm equips it with A2AD assets of its own. Therefore, in any conflict, Kaliningrad will be surrounded and extremely difficult for Russia to reinforce and resupply. Additionally, Sweden's accession to NATO opens up alternative ways to reinforce the vulnerable Baltic states. The Suwalki Gap, the short border between Poland and Lithuania, which is sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Russia's vassal state of Belarus, has long been considered NATO's biggest geostrategic weakness. A pincer movement of Russian forces between these two lines could cut the Baltic states off from their NATO allies by land, while Russia overwhelms them with great numerical superiority over a short front. But with Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic states can now be reinforced through a direct sea route that Russia is in a poor position to dispute. Sweden joining the alliance makes the Baltic, for all practical purposes, a NATO lake. Russia is now surrounded by hostile coastlines in the Baltic Sea, making it practically impossible for it to transit its ships through the area. In any confrontation, NATO is in position to take control of the sea and cut off Russian trade while reinforcing hotspots as needed. Sweden not only brings geographical advantages at sea, but also on land. Its accession to NATO and the reunification of 2 centuries of military non-alignment also opens an unbroken land corridor between Norway and Finland. If either country were to be attacked along its respective borders with Russia, Sweden can act as a supply and troop transit hub for the other. Sweden's accession to NATO also comes with military advantages. Though often lampooned as being somehow effeminate and lacking vigor in its military affairs, Sweden is better prepared for conflict than many of its European neighbors. Although it does not currently meet its NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense, spending only 1.3% in 2022, that number has steadily increased from a low of 1% in 2018. Stockholm plans to continue with this trend and accelerate it. In 2022, Sweden claimed that it aimed to reach the 2% mark by 2026. In September 2023, Sweden doubled down on this, with its defense ministry saying that it would already meet NATO's definition of the 2% mark in 2024, since the alliance's definition is broader and includes more items than appropriations. Nevertheless, on an official defense ministry document, Stockholm insisted it would not be stopping there. The government intends to continue proposing additional resources in the coming years so that the military defense appropriations will equate to 2% of GDP. Sweden also has an advanced military, despite its historically low level of spending. Among its useful assets is a fleet of 122 Stridsvagn tanks, an upgraded variant of the German Leopard 2. Sweden agreed to send 10 of its Stridsvagn tanks to Ukraine in February 2023. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has since lost 6 of these, but they demonstrated their worth in an incident from October, where a Russian anti-tank missile destroyed one of the Swedish tanks. However, the crew survived. Sweden thus brings additional tanks to NATO's land forces, ones which protect the lives of valuable tank crews from common anti-armor weapons. Aside from its tanks, Sweden has about 8,000 other vehicles and 26 self-propelled artillery systems, but it's lacking in MLRS systems and towed artillery, as it has none of them, according to the Global Firepower Index. Entry into NATO and an increase in its military budget should reduce this deficiency. In the skies, the Swedes command a fleet of about 30 Saab JAS-39 Gripen aircraft. These fourth-generation jet fighters come packed with the Beyond Visual Range Meteor air-to-air missile, which entered service in 2016. These projectiles have a range of about 150 kilometers with a no-escape zone of 60 kilometers. The no-escape zone is the area where there is a high probability of a kill even when the target is notified of the incoming threat. The Meteor's 60-kilometer range for this is the largest among the world's air-to-air missiles. The missile is, according to Saab, highly resistant to active and passive countermeasures like chaff, flares, and electronic warfare. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukraine has asked Sweden for Gripen fighter jets, and in August 2023 claimed that Ukrainian pilots were already training on them. In December, Ukraine and Sweden officially began dialogue on whether to donate some of the latter's Gripens to the Ukrainian Air Force. Sweden's entry into the alliance also offers the potential for its air force to get even stronger. Finland, for example, began its F-35 program in December 2021, when Helsinki selected the Lightning II to replace the FA-18 Hornets in its arsenal. Finland ordered 64 F-35 planes in a deal worth about $9.4 billion. As early as 2014, Sweden signed an agreement to train together with Finland and allow NATO assistance in a crisis. Now that both countries are part of NATO, it's possible and even likely that Sweden will get its own F-35 fleet in the near future, especially since more foreign countries are already opting for it over Sweden's capable Gripen in international arms deals. Sweden has also expressed interest in being part of the multinational effort to develop a 6th-generation fighter jet. It was once part of the Global Air Combat Program alongside the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan, although it officially withdrew from the effort in November 2023. It remains to be seen if Sweden enters another effort to produce a 6th-generation fighter. That same month, Stockholm announced it would hold off on procuring a future fighter until 2031, after which it would assess risks and possibilities. What we do know is that Sweden is starting to think about a fighter to succeed the Gripen so that it can strengthen its air force against future threats. Either way, it will only get stronger over time, thanks to the renewed commitments to its domestic defense and its seriousness about its role in NATO. But Sweden's most powerful addition to NATO's arsenal is not on land or in the skies, but on the seas. If Finland's entry provided an almost fatal check to Russian power on land, Sweden does the same on, and even maybe more importantly, under the seas. Although Sweden only has 5 submarines, 3 of them are of the advanced Gotland class. These submarines are powered by a novel method, the Stirling Air Independent Propulsion (AIP) system. Unlike most conventional submarines, the Gotland class uses liquid oxygen stored in onboard tanks to run diesel engines when the vessel's batteries need to be recharged. This means that they do not need to surface as part of this procedure, as a traditional diesel-electric sub must do. The AIP method not only comes with greater stealth, it also allows for deployment periods normally only seen with nuclear submarines, and indeed, consensus is that the Gotland-class submarine is the most advanced non-nuclear type ever built. Such long deployments are valuable assets for NATO, even in a defensive role. The Baltic is a narrow area with several natural choke points. Stationing Sweden's Gotland-class submarines in these choke points will enable their crews to listen in on and detect Russian submarines and other naval operations, increasing NATO's intelligence gathering capacity and its ability to defend vital infrastructure like gas pipelines and underwater communication cables, which Russian submarine crews are trained to find and disrupt or tap into. Sweden's submarines will also be able to stay there for weeks at a time, remaining on constant alert. Ironically, submarine operations in the Baltic have been a traditional weakness in NATO because with an average depth of only 60 meters, it's too shallow for nuclear-powered subs to operate in. And because the United States Navy's underwater vessels are all nuclear-powered, they have not been able to contribute to the security of the Baltic. The importance of this security is often overlooked, as the Baltic is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, accounting for roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade. Sweden's entry into NATO mitigates this security deficiency. The Baltic also has varying salinity levels due to the large amounts of rivers that feed it. This variation changes the buoyancy of a submarine and the amount of noise it makes. One must know these waters to stay silent. And because Sweden has been operating submarines in the Baltic since 1904, longer than any other country, it has institutional experience that no other state can match. Submarine Flotilla Commander Fredrik Linden perhaps best described the situation in an interview with Reuters. "We have expertise, which fills a gap, expertise that NATO doesn't have." 2 more submarines are scheduled for delivery in Sweden by 2028. This new type, called the A-26, will be able to launch remote-controlled or autonomous underwater drones to further increase intelligence collection and reduce risk to the crew. Sweden has a robust surface fleet too, with 35 fleet units in its active inventory as of 2024, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships. These ships are mostly light corvettes and offshore patrol vessels, but it will also bring 9 valuable mine warfare ships. At the very least, Sweden's entry into NATO adds to Russia's naval disadvantages in the Baltic. The Kremlin simply does not have the numbers or the firepower to compete with NATO's naval forces there, and it will not be able to do so anytime soon. NATO's combined navy has gotten much stronger with Sweden's membership, while the balance has tipped even more against Russia. For Putin, this is likely a big personal blow to his pride. Like many Russian rulers before him stretching back to Peter the Great, he has fancied his country as a sea power and has tried but failed to restore the Russian Navy's Soviet-era capabilities. Now Russia's access to the world's waterways is even further restricted, and it all came because of its latest dictator's own actions. But the Swedes don't intend to add to NATO only through air and sea power. Stockholm has every intention of doing so on land as much as it can. In that regard, the Swedes pledged to increase the size of their army by 30,000 personnel, with a 2025 timetable bringing the total up to 90,000. The 2024 budget includes investments in order to make this happen, such as increased appropriations for officer training. The new troops will be a welcome addition to the forward missions of NATO's multinational battle groups, which have been deployed in increased numbers to the countries bordering Ukraine since the start of the invasion. In the worst-case scenario, Sweden's bigger army will constitute a nearby reserve on an immediate call to help the beleaguered and outnumbered Baltic states. Sweden also has a reserve force of 32,900 personnel, plus 25,000 paramilitary troops. It has a total manpower reserve of 4.2 million. Overall, Sweden's military is ranked 29th in the 2024 list provided by the Global Firepower Index. In addition to its existing military technology and assets, Sweden has a robust arms industry despite its traditional neutrality. This gives the country a good foundation to actually carry through with its stated intentions on building a modern military. It's in a much better position to rearm than Germany, for example, whose frequent pledges to increase military spending have always fallen short. Sweden's arms industry will also be able to help other NATO members rearm adequately, and thanks to its strategic position, Sweden can serve as a convenient nearby hub to manufacture equipment and ammunition, which the war in Ukraine has shown gets depleted at a staggering rate in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine deeply disturbed the nations of Europe. It was disturbing enough for Sweden to end over 200 years of military neutrality, which prevailed even during both world wars. In fact, the last time Sweden entered an armed conflict was in 1814 with the Swedish-Norwegian War. Thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that has now changed, and Sweden is arming once again. Historically, Russia was Sweden's greatest enemy, and Putin clearly recalled unpleasant memories for the Swedes, no matter how deeply buried they were. Putin may have wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance through an easy victory in Ukraine, but his failure to scare the world with the Russian military might only have made his geopolitical disadvantage worse. With Sweden's imminent entry, NATO is now stronger, and the vice around Russia in the Baltic is all but closed. Russia is now at its weakest position there since the Great Northern War in the early 18th century. The Swedes under Charles XII lost that conflict, and Russia soon became the preeminent power in the Baltic. Over 2 centuries later, it almost feels like the ghost of Charles XII is finally having the last laugh. Russia's current dictator Putin may walk away from his war with some territorial gains in Ukraine, but for him, was it worth the balance of power tipping even more in NATO's favor thanks to Sweden's entry into the alliance? He can pretend all he likes that none of this bothers him, but holed up in the Kremlin, he probably isn't too happy about this development, to say the least. Meanwhile, Sweden is in a military alliance with all the other Scandinavian states for the first time since the Kalmar Union in 1523. Putin's aggression united the Nordic countries in a way not seen in 5 centuries. So much for weakening and overawing the West. What do you think about Sweden's accession to NATO? In what other ways might it alter European geopolitics? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out Why is Sweden preparing for war with Russia? Or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 escalated a conflict that began with Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014, transforming it into a full-blown war marked by substantial losses on both sides. The question of how many soldiers Russia has lost looms large. While Putin may present figures suggesting minimal losses, evidence from Ukraine and Western media paints a starkly different picture of Russian casualties. Yet the toll of this conflict extends beyond the battlefield casualties. Significant damage to equipment, weapons, and lost territories underscores the war's broader impact. What do these losses indicate about the current state of Putin's war in Ukraine and its possible future trajectory? Let's dive in. From the outset, Putin believed it would be a relatively short war, lasting a few weeks and with minimal casualties. What followed were months of fierce attritional fighting, with both sides and independent reports claiming higher and higher casualties. With the severe underestimation of the duration and extent of the war, it was likely that Putin believed that Russian casualties wouldn't reach more than a few hundred or a few thousand. But then the true figures started rolling in. With a large chunk of the world focused on the ongoing conflict, at least until Israel declared war on Hamas, it's understandable that both Russia and Ukraine would want to twist the narrative in their favor. Indeed, one of the first reports from Russia in June 2022 spoke of only 5,900 deaths in the Russian armed forces. On the other hand, reports from the US and UK suggested that the actual figure was closer to 15,000. Ukrainian reports went further still, stating that as many as 30,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in the first few months of the war. So which figure is correct? There's no way to know for certain, but a study published in the peer-reviewed scientific journal PNAS suggested that there's a method to how each country displays its losses. On average, Ukraine reports nearly double the number of actual Russian deaths, but doesn't have a bias towards reporting their own deaths. This is possibly in an attempt to gain further support from the countries sympathetic to Ukraine's cause, such as members of the EU and NATO that are supplying Ukraine with military aid. On the other hand, Russia severely underreports deaths of their own soldiers at a rate of roughly 0.3 per 1 actual death. Any figure from Russia, therefore, should be nearly tripled to get a value that's close to correct. Additionally, the Russian media reports Ukrainian deaths at a ratio of a staggering 4.3 to 1. Meaning that Russians are led to believe that more than 4 times as many Ukrainians have died than have in reality. As a result, getting accurate figures on Russian casualties from either Ukrainian or Russian media can be a serious undertaking, considering the number fudging that the state media outlets do to further their own war agenda. Luckily, that's where unofficial reports from Russian media outlets and military, or reports from independent media, can shed light on the whole truth. One of the most notable reports coming from the Russian side was that of the Wagner Group, a private military group funded by the Russian government. In a May 2023 report that was mostly unauthorized by the state media, the then leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, revealed that the Wagner company lost around 22,000 troops and had 40,000 more injured. Based on that report and extrapolating from the size of Wagner compared to the Russian military, reports from the UK and US media suggested that Russia lost around 120,000 soldiers by August 2023, with another 170,000 wounded. This could support the numbers outlined in the PNAS study, which suggested that the actual deaths of Russians by February 2023 were around 77,000. As such, estimates by the UK and US media were on the right track, though the actual numbers are much more difficult to confirm. That's where BBC Russia and Media Zona, an independent news outlet, joined forces to investigate wartime deaths thoroughly. Unlike traditional reports based solely on field reports and those from the militaries, the BBC delved deeper and tried to individually document every death on either side of the conflict. This was done through not only reports, but required actual military records, the circumstances that led to the death, and reports from the person's local area, all of which would likely be more nuanced and detailed. In many cases, reporters went all over the country to extract information about the recently deceased from graveyards, parades, and war memorials, scouring for new names and graves. The investigators also searched for posts on social media from the deceased relatives and friends or obituaries published in local newspapers. The essence of the detailed search was that each death had to have a name attached. No longer were the numbers just figures that would pop into someone's head only to be forgotten a few seconds later. They were now real people who had died for their country, no matter how flawed the cause. This stringent set of criteria led to many of the deaths being overlooked due to the investigators' inability to confirm whether what was in the report, from either Russian or Ukrainian outlets, was actually true. However, with the BBC's backing of the data, the BBC Russia Media Zona report is considered the closest to the actual count of Russian soldier deaths, if not going under the real figure due to the aforementioned difficulties in obtaining the correct figures. If someone's name was on the list, then that means the person most likely existed and died during the Russo-Ukrainian War. The figures reported in October 2023 by BBC Russia suggested that Russia had lost around 88,000 soldiers 20 months into the war. BBC Russia didn't provide an estimate of the injured in that period, but the US news outlets reported around 170,000 injuries around August 2023, which was the most realistic estimate at the time. Better yet, the report was so detailed that the outlets could track down the deceased soldiers to the exact unit they served in. This served to create a detailed analysis of Russia's wartime efforts, as well as the average number of soldiers present in the Russian military. The reports from the early months of the war roughly correlated with what you'd expect most common deaths to be: younger soldiers on the front lines, with the average being a 21-year-old male professional soldier. However, the figures from the later months in the report suggested that there was an increasing number of former prison inmates in the Wagner Group and pilots dying than usual. This is important for two reasons. First, it showcased that the Russian military, despite a widespread effort to conscript more soldiers, was bolstered by those most likely unwilling to actually fight for the country and were coerced into stepping onto the front lines. Inmates accounted for roughly 18.6% of all deaths recorded by BBC and Media Zona. This highlights the extent of desperation present in the Wagner Group to bolster its trained military with people considered expendable meat shields for the more vital soldiers in the units. Second, the deaths of pilots meant that Russia was being drained of highly specialized military troops that it couldn't train in time to replace the deceased. In some estimates, it takes roughly $3 million and multiple years to make a pilot combat ready. This means that each pilot taken down by Ukrainian forces results in the grounding of a part of Russia's air force. Another independent outlet, Medusa, worked alongside the previously mentioned Media Zone to conduct its own study on the Russian casualties during the war. Unlike the investigation done by the BBC, Medusa relied on information from the Russian probate registries, which are used when real estate or cars are inherited when their original owner dies. By going through the number of open cases that use the probate registry, Medusa could approximate the excess mortality in the Russian population. This methodology is akin to the estimates used during the COVID-19 pandemic, where Russia obfuscated the number of deaths in the country for similar reasons. Since the pandemic wasn't over in 2021, Medusa had to fall back down to data prior to 2020. The news website published its full methodology alongside the sources the outlet used to make their claims. According to its study, Medusa reported that Russia had 25,000 excess deaths by the end of 2022, which was likely most, if not all, from the Russo-Ukrainian War. Similarly, the outlet suggested around 47,000 excess deaths by May 2023, just 5 months after the first report, showcasing that the deaths sharply increased in 2023. If we take these figures to be true, then the estimate by the BBC of 88,000 deaths in October is probably as close to reality as we can get. But those are figures from mid to late 2023, and the war is still going. What are the most recently updated figures? According to the latest data presented by BBC Russia, the total Russian death toll could be as high as 107,000 as of February 2024, and that's not all. When compounded with the estimates of severe injuries that cause soldiers to be discharged from the service, the total losses of the Russian army could amount to as many as 321,000. This figure closely aligns with the numbers published by the US news outlets, suggesting around 315,000 losses. This accounts for more than 85% of the troops in Russia's pre-invasion available forces, which were around 360,000. Of the estimated 107,000 casualties over the course of 24 months, the war resulted in 53,500 casualties on the Russian side alone. Compare that to the other notable wars, and the figure is higher than the war in Iraq, 2013-17, 50,095 deaths per year, and the Syrian civil war, 2011 to present, 43,736 deaths per year. When combined with the losses suffered by Ukraine, the death toll is a staggering 95,000 per year. This makes the Russo-Ukrainian War the deadliest conflict in the 21st century, beating out the Tigray War in Ethiopia. But the number of human casualties paints only part of the picture of the true losses suffered by Russia as a result of invading Ukraine. Also devastating have been the other military losses during the war, that of equipment and infrastructure. According to a February 2023 report, Russia lost roughly half of its battle-ready tanks a year into the war, crippling its ability to mount a unified offensive. This partly led to the drawn-out conflicts going on today. Yet another report in April 2023 suggested that Russia has lost over 10,000 pieces of vital military equipment, including tanks, trucks, artillery, and drones. In some cases, the losses were so severe that the Russian military was forced to redeploy some Soviet and Cold War-era tanks, which were veritable museum pieces in 2022. This is a huge downgrade in Russian military capacity. While the T-54s were among the peak tanks in the 20th century, their usefulness sharply dropped with new anti-tank weapons being developed in the late 80s and 90s. Today, a T-54 is no match for the most devastating weapons fielded by Ukraine that the UK, France, and the US have been steadily providing to the front lines. Furthermore, the T-54's 100mm guns struggle to penetrate modern armor, making them relatively useless in tank-to-tank warfare. Considering that is a relatively rare occurrence, the T-54 still poses some threat to infantry and light, unarmored tanks and vehicles such as the Soviet-era Grad launcher both sides are still using to this day. Comparatively, Ukraine has reintroduced most of its old weaponry, such as the T-55, but its fleet was upgraded with modern 105mm L7 guns capable of piercing through contemporary armor. Ukrainian tanks have also upgraded engines and tactical equipment, putting Russia woefully behind in technology on the front lines. According to some reports, Russia is even holding back its tanks for later use and trying to stockpile as many tanks as possible. This includes the newly built T-90s and the older T-62, T-72, and T-80s that Russia has pulled out of cold storage. As a result, most of the forces currently fighting on the front lines are purely infantry, and Russia is accruing more losses by the day. This could point to Russia trying to accumulate enough tanks for a final push in the future, and is using its infantry as cannon fodder to try and lower Ukraine's defenses as much as possible before that happens. While this might sound like a dubious plan by Russia's military command, the fact is that Russia has roughly 4 times the population of Ukraine. While of course not everyone can be conscripted, the attritional nature of the war could lead to Russia gaining some ground in the long term, since it can absorb heavier losses and regroup its efforts later. However, this has led to multiple waves of conscription efforts in the country, usually focused on lower density regions. This is partially due to the comparatively lower salaries outside of the major cities, usually around $500 per month compared to $1,200 in Moscow. Additionally, a military contract provides up to $2,500 per month, making it lucrative to lower-earning people in remote provinces. As a result, other reports from Medusa suggest that people in far-off provinces are much more likely to be the casualties of the Russo-Ukrainian War. The outlet states that for every Muscovite that dies in the war, 275 people in Buryatia and 350 people in Tuva die, which are some of the poorest regions predominantly inhabited by various minorities. It's not just the poor that have suffered over the course of the war. The conscription efforts have shaken the country to its core, resulting in waves of people emigrating from Russia to avoid being conscripted. If that wasn't the primary reason, then many more have suffered from Russia's attempts to subvert the public on how the war is actually going. In some extreme cases, the authorities have forbidden people from creating memorials for the fallen ones or spreading information about Russia's war efforts. According to some estimates, more than 900,000 Russians have left the country since the invasion. These are mostly people with the means to book prohibitively expensive flights or find other methods to legally escape the country. As such, they are primarily middle-class citizens, usually in IT and service sectors that brought significant income to the country via taxes. This is a huge blow to Russia's economy, but it's not the only one. Due to Russia's plentiful supply of oil and natural gas and the EU's previous lack of those resources, the country could command high prices on the market and invest significant funds into building a pipeline infrastructure. However, due to the invasion and most of Europe siding with Ukraine, that trade has trickled to a portion of what it used to be and has stopped altogether in some cases. This led to Russia needing to find an alternative source of funding to power its war machine. That's where China entered the picture. As a resource-demanding country with pretty much no access to oil and gas, as well as precious building materials and minerals internally, China has previously used overseas oil importers from the Persian Gulf. Recent geopolitical influence from the US in the area made China hesitant to fully rely on the Gulf as its sole source of oil and gas. For that reason, they had to diversify. Former Soviet countries such as Tajikistan account for a noticeable fraction of China's oil imports, but the country saw an opportunity in the new conflict between the Russians and Ukrainians. China positioned itself as one of Russia's biggest allies throughout the war, at least on the surface. It has not condemned any of Russia's military operations inside Ukraine and has consistently abstained in negotiations and discussions in the UN regarding Russia. Additionally, China has negotiated a significant trade deal with Russia for its oil, gas, and resources from the Siberian Far East. Faced with losing a bulk of its export funding from the West, Russia was forced to accept exporting oil and gas to China at prices roughly half of those the resources had with its Western partners. Despite that, the Russian economy is still going relatively strong, even if it's becoming obvious that a bulk of it is solely oriented toward its war efforts. But it's still suffering from the inability to trade properly with other countries and extreme losses in manpower and equipment that requires a lot of funding to replace. As a result, Russia's central bank reported in 2023 that the country's inflation rate is roughly 11.1%. However, the actual prices paint a much grimmer picture of Russia's economy. Some economists suggest that the actual inflation rate in Russia is closer to 60%, with food prices spiking up to 75% compared to the figures from 2022. If this continues, Russia could end up with a runaway inflation problem that threatens the entire country's economy with collapse. This is bolstered by the fact that interest rates in Russia's banks have soared to 15%. The interest hike is not the first in the history of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Shortly after the invasion, banks set the interest rate to 20% but lowered them to normal levels shortly afterward. However, it looks like the current economic situation is dire enough that the interest rates will stay as is. It's forced many residents to move their disposable income into savings accounts, with estimates putting the deposit rates at 32%, much higher than those in the Western world, such as in the UK with only 9%. The increased savings deposit can lead to a domino effect. With a significant chunk of money locked away in savings accounts, the Russian economy, or more accurately its citizens, won't have enough disposable capital to maintain itself. Regardless, the Russian media consistently reports that the country's economy is doing well, and the rest of the world begrudgingly agrees. The IMF reported that Russia's economy grew faster than any country currently on the G7 list: France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, the UK, and the US. This paints a bleak picture and suggests that the war might extend for a couple more years. But is this growth actually sustainable by any standards? The short answer is no. While Russia's economy is arguably doing well enough to support its war efforts, all measures taken by Russia's government are ultimately patchwork solutions that will create an unbalanced, highly centralized economy focused on the big Russian cities. Additionally, if the conscription efforts continue, there's probably going to be a lack of available recruits from Russia's poorer areas. This will mean that Russia will finally have to aggressively recruit from Moscow and other big cities. These are the same places that are powering Russia's propaganda machine. Currently, Muscovites don't feel the effect of the war on their daily life, apart from slightly increased prices in the country's capital. Their standard of living hasn't been affected yet. But if Russia is required to pull their recruits from the same people that are propping up the Russian economy and are completely oblivious to the real state of the country, the wall of illusion will break rapidly. With that comes the potential acknowledgement that Russia has lost more than just soldiers. The economy is being supported artificially. China has basically made Russia accept any and all terms in order to have their plentiful oil and gas exported at any price. The rest of Europe has seen that Putin's regime is no longer as ironclad as it used to be and is heavily dependent on the core of Russia being none the wiser about the reality of the war and fate of the country. If that happens, the consequences for Russia could be catastrophic. The current prognosis on the war is that Russia can't make a meaningful push into Ukraine in 2024 due to consistent setbacks in obtaining the right equipment, most of which is being imported from China. That means that Russia is facing another year of uncertainty where it must push more people into the war's meat grinder to maintain a semblance of superiority over Ukraine, at least in the eyes of its most devoted populace. As such, the future is uncertain. China's moves in recent years suggest that it might consider attacking Russia for the precious resources and drinking water of Siberia. However, it's more likely that China will keep up with an endless stream of demands to either prolong the war or enforce its own peace terms on both countries to get the best deal. Regardless, it's most likely that Russia will become nothing more than a Chinese puppet, either exporting most of its resources to China in return for complete influence, both technologically and politically. Alternatively, China will actually invade Russia and take the country's resources for itself. In either case, Russia will likely cease being a meaningful player on the world stage and be forced to pander to Chinese whims. Of course, even these scenarios aren't certain. With the US hinting that China is not a severe threat to the world, it's likely that the US military has already poised itself to take advantage of any moves China makes and retaliate appropriately. But how? By cutting off the country's resource supplies to the south before it can recuperate from preying on Russia. That puts everyone in a state of stalemate. In any case, Russia has lost more than 1 million people overall, whether due to death, injuries, or widespread immigration, and its economy stands to lose even more. The fate of the country rests with Putin's current regime and whether it can gain a meaningful victory over Ukraine and enforce peace terms that enable the economy to bounce back. Otherwise, Russia may collapse in the same way the Soviet Union collapsed 3 decades before. But what do you think is going to happen with Russia? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now, go and check out why Russia's military arsenal is low, weak, and outdated. Or click this other video instead.
Throughout the 21st century, Russia and China's economic ties have openly deepened. However, the relationship between these two superpowers is a strenuous one, and it wouldn't take much to make them mortal enemies. What would it take? And if either of these two countries did attack each other, what would prompt them to do so? And who would win? While neither country is willing to admit the reality of their relationship, the signs are there. To understand them, we need to delve into their geopolitical histories. Both countries have long traditions rich in warfare and attempts to claim superiority in their respective regions. For Russia, that's the Great Eurasian Steppe. Russia's historical ties to the steppe can be traced back to its origins as an Eastern Slavic country. However, the geography of northeastern Europe is steeped in low-lying flatland that is incredibly difficult to defend against invaders due to its sheer size and exposure. And Russia has been on the receiving end of many invasions, with perhaps the most notable being the Napoleonic Wars. Although Russia fended off the French, it showcased the relative ease with which the European part of Russia could be attacked via the Germanic lands. That's why Russia has spent considerable resources to secure its European borders and relations, which came to a head in the 20th century with the USSR. Apart from being at its peak territorially, Russia held diplomatic ties with most of Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact, which elevated its influence over most of the Eurasian steppe. But the situation didn't last. With the USSR dissolving and many European countries joining the US-led NATO, Russia's borders of influence were equated to its actual borders, perilously close to the country's main population centers in Europe. China's territory has ebbed and flowed over the millennia. China's current policy seems focused on claiming parts of territories it has historically owned, including but not limited to Taiwan, parts of India in the Himalayas, and swathes of the South China Sea. These territorial disputes have brought the US and several Indo-Pacific countries together to form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, QSD or the Quad, to curb China's influence in the area. The main thorn in China's internal and external diplomacy is Taiwan. technically led by the Republic of China, which it considers a rebellious remnant of the country that needs to be brought back into the fold. However, Taiwan has the military and diplomatic backing of the US. If China decided to abandon diplomacy and invade Taiwan, it would be no doubt met by US-armed Taiwanese forces, with the rest of the Quad following close behind. This would likely create a prolonged war similar to the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Further complicating China's foreign policy is its robust yet fragile domestic industry. As a country with the second largest population on Earth, China is woefully lacking in natural resources to support that many people working and producing for the economy. China imports most of its oil and natural gas, as well as mineral, drinking water, and timber. What makes the US particularly dangerous to China's economy is the fact that most of its oil and natural gas supplies come through shipments from the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, a vast majority of this sea traffic has to pass through the tightly controlled Strait of Malacca. To salvage the situation, China claims most of the South China Sea, almost up to the strait itself, and opposes most other countries with access to the ocean. Still, if China decided to attack Taiwan or seriously try to control its portions of the South or East China Sea, it would no doubt be opposed by the Indo-Pacific countries. As a result, the strait would likely be shut off to Chinese vessels. This would cripple the Chinese resource-demanding economy and would likely result in the country's collapse as we know it, with unfathomable consequences for world politics. With opposition from all sides, it would seem natural that Russia and China would become allies, in an attempt to curb the American influence on its borders. NATO for Russia, the Quad for China. However, this is the point where history gets complex. You see, while China and Russia are currently presenting a united front against the US, their historical ties are more hostile than you might think. Even when both countries were communist in the mid-20th century, the regimes clashed over their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. But the most contested Chinese-Russian relations are due to two treaties in the mid-19th century. During the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, Imperial China was under heavy political, diplomatic, and military pressure from colonial and foreign imperial forces, starting with the Opium Wars and ending with the country's reinvention as the Communist People's Republic of China. The 110 years of opposition from the West has been dubbed as the Century of Humiliation by the Chinese, with many politicians repeatedly citing all the losses China suffered during that period. As part of the Century of Humiliation, China was forced to sign several so-called unequal treaties, in which China had to cede parts of its territory, control, or other diplomatic material. With Russia in particular, the two most important treaties were the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking, which resulted in China losing the province of Outer Manchuria. While Chinese officials claim that the province isn't a point of contention, reality begs to differ. The division made by the two treaties was somewhat ambiguous, resorting to using the two main rivers in the region, Amur and Ussuri, as borders between Russia and China. However, Russia claims that all the islands in the river belong to Russia, while China claims that the border goes through the middle of the rivers, assigning the islands to a country based on its location against the middle of the river. In fact, the entire area has been hotly contested by China. Even in the 20th century, a 7-month military conflict between the Chinese and the Russians took place over the contested islands, particularly the Zhenbao or Damansky Island on the Ussuri. The 2-week battle over Zhenbao resulted in hundreds of casualties on both sides and created more than 3.5 decades of tension over the islands. Furthermore, the sedimentary island, called Bolshoi Ussuriski Island or Haiksazi Island, has also been a sore spot in China's history. It stands in the confluence of the rivers, right on the border between the two countries. Claims over the island's territory have been going on since the treaties. Eventually, the two countries ratified the control of the island in a 2004 agreement that split the island between them and permitted China to use the Amur and Ussur rivers for ship traffic. However, it seems China hasn't caught up to the agreement just yet. In a map published in 2023, China displayed the entirety of the Bolshoi Ussuriski Island as being under Chinese control. While this may have been an oversight, it could also mean that China has plans regarding the previously debated region. The island itself is an undeveloped piece of land and would be an afterthought were it not for its favorable geographical position. Lying at the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, the island is perilously close to Khabarovsk, the second largest city in Outer Manchuria, which overlooks the island. Since Russia controls the portion of the island on the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, it can also control the shipping routes that are usable when the river isn't iced over. The Amur also has considerable hydroelectric and fishing capacity, something that China could greatly use due to its reliance on energy imports. Additionally, China's Ministry of Natural Resources has issued a statement relabeling cities and provinces in the Outer Manchuria region, which belongs to Russia, with Chinese names, usually historical ones from before the treaties. While it might seem that the region is relatively useless to China, you have to keep the bigger picture in mind. Outer Manchuria is one of the most populated and industrialized regions of the Russian Far East, with two cities having over 600,000 inhabitants, Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. The region is inhabited by around 4 million people, half of the entire Russian Far East population, compared to over 100 million people in the neighboring Chinese provinces. If war were to break out, China would have a massive initial manpower advantage, and the people could easily inhabit the sparsely populated Russian region after the fact. What makes Outer Manchuria a possible first front of the Sino-Russo War is also the aforementioned fact that China is a relatively resource-deprived nation. Since there are roughly 1 billion people in the country, China has a massive resource demand for energy, minerals, and even drinking water. Currently, most of the country, even though it contains some of the biggest rivers in the world, can barely produce enough to satisfy the population's need. Additionally, the biggest population center in the North China Plain has pretty much no natural drinking water supply, relying on the rest of the country and imports for its drinking water sources. As a result, China is looking for ready water supplies elsewhere, with two lucrative options: India and Russia. With pre-existing territorial disputes with India, China could potentially look into invading the water-rich Himalayan region it stakes a claim to. However, India itself houses the largest population in the world and faces a similar water scarcity problem, relying on the same region for drinking water. This makes the country much more defensive of the contested territory. Add to that the fact that India is in the Quad and also has beneficial trade relations with the West, and the US, Quad, and NATO would come down hard on China if it started an invasion on Indian soil. This leaves Russia as one of the key interest points for acquiring more resources. In terms of drinking water, Siberia is generally river-rich. However, by far the largest concentration of drinking water is in Lake Baltic, the biggest lake by volume, outstripping all Great Lakes combined, with estimates suggesting it could support the world population for decades by itself. In fact, a Chinese company aggressively purchased land around the lake in the 2010s, with plans to construct a pipeline and supply China with fresh water in 2017. The local population protested about the construction, and the Russian government intervened, forcing the Chinese company to abandon any plans to build up Lake Baltic. This doesn't mean that China will keel over. With its economy highly dependent on resources that it currently needs to import, and much of its oil and natural gas imports coming from either the Strait of Malacca or Russia itself, China might look to remove one of the middlemen from the equation. Since its south is bound in overseas territorial disputes and influenced by US foreign policies, Russia might be the next obvious choice. With Outer Manchuria as the entryway, China could gain access to the entire Siberian region, which is rich in oil, natural gas, minerals, timber, and water. All the resources the country desperately needs to function. Furthermore, with the Russian Far East so far removed from the population and influence centers in Europe, and the Russian army currently embroiled in its own war with Ukraine, China could consider invading Russia at any moment. This way, Beijing would gain the upper hand and succeed in a quick war, the kind Putin previously failed to accomplish in Ukraine 2 years prior. Remember, most of the issues that Russia is facing right now in Ukraine are due to intervention from NATO countries. The same issues that likely won't provide Russia with any assistance against China. However, a Chinese invasion might prompt the US and the Quad to exercise their own plans to cut off China in the south, possibly creating a chain reaction of war declarations similar to that of the World Wars. Additionally, Outer Manchuria, and the Siberian region by extension, would provide China with greater access to the Pacific coastline through the Sea of Japan or the Russian Pacific coastline itself. In fact, if China were determined to bring the entirety of the Russian Far East under its own control, it could gain access to the Arctic shore itself. This is vital for an entirely different reason. You see, the main shipping routes around Eurasia and Africa currently rely on the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, followed by the Strait of Malacca to transport goods between Western Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Alternatively to the Suez-Hormuz line would be the Cape of Good Hope, southern Horn of Africa, a route that is around 4,000 nautical miles longer. But the Arctic contains a sea and a lot of ice that's navigable for at least a part of the year during warmer months when the ice cover is smaller. While the Arctic was previously relatively unused for maritime transport for that reason, global warming has changed the situation rapidly. A change of even a few degrees Celsius has been enough to drastically reduce the ice sheet over the Arctic Circle and open up previously inaccessible waters to ships. The Russian-controlled Northern Sea route is currently the biggest and the shortest trading route in the region, with the other option going through the Northwest route in Alaskan and Canadian waters. According to some studies, Arctic routes could be between 30 and 50% shorter, either in time spent at sea or distance, than those using the Suez or Panama canals, while eliminating the possible bottlenecks at the two artificial channels, a fact that became painfully obvious in the Evergreen incident in 2021. The tenuous geopolitics in Russia leave it open for influence from both the West, with which it is in a proxy war through Ukraine, and China, where it sells oil, gas, and other resources for the much-needed capital to fuel its economy and military efforts. The current situation plays well into China's hands, giving them unparalleled reach into Siberia through ongoing trade, all without actually needing to invest resources in invading the country or forcing Russia to accept the deal. With Russia stuck in a prolonged war it seemingly has no way of getting out of, it was forced to sell oil and gas to China at roughly half the rate it did to European countries. Naturally, this gives China a clear economic benefit from the Russo-Ukrainian war. As such, it works in China's favor to have Russia occupy the US and EU military efforts into Ukraine, while at the same time siphoning the resources it needs from Russia without resorting to trade through the Strait of Malacca. This has led to China famously not condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and abstaining in any peace talks or dialogues to end the war in the region. It's quite clear that Putin's regime is working out well for China, and the country will likely remain a stern ally so long as the situation doesn't change. Furthermore, while the previous 2 years might have led everyone to believe Russia has a robust economy and is a veritable superpower in its own right, the truth is a bit more nuanced. Russia's population is roughly 1/10 of China's, and while the countries have a comparable GDP, gross domestic product, per capita, China's size gives it a clear edge. In fact, in current estimates, China is the world's second largest economy, while Russia makes it to 11th place by total GDP. The economic disparity and Russia's military, economic, and diplomatic losses that followed the invasion of Ukraine make any deals fall naturally in China's favor. So long as Russia is cut off from the rest of the world financially, it's forced to accept China's terms in order to sell its resources and power its economy. However, the melting Arctic ice might put a dent in that plan. If Russia were able to operate independent shipping year-round and impose tariffs on goods traveling through the northeast route, it could create a secondary stream of income and gain a semblance of economic independence from China. Additionally, just because Russia's current regime is favorable to China doesn't mean that the situation will stay that way. The war in Ukraine might be protracted, but it won't last forever, and Russia might reconsider its allegiance to China in the long run and cut off resource export to China from its Far East. Many experts believe that Russia doesn't have the military power to press further into Ukraine in 2024. With Ukraine steadily holding on to the support it receives from the EU and NATO, the war might be reaching a breaking point within the next few years. While there are a few possibilities on how the war will end, one of the predictions is that Russia's current regime will collapse. This will pave the way for a different leadership, with a potentially revolutionary outlook on Russia's long-term future in both Europe and Asia. The leadership might align itself more with Europe, China, or a third party altogether, and some of those scenarios might stop it from playing right into China's hands. If Russia does end up weakened enough from the Ukrainian war or start opposing its ongoing trade with China, then China wouldn't have many options left. Since the current regime under Xi is fervently opposed to the influence radiating from the US onto the Indo-Pacific, the resource-starved Chinese will need to obtain more goods from its north, i.e. Russia. This circles back to the seemingly solved dispute between Russia and China on the matter of which country controls parts of Outer Manchuria. While China has gained back most of the territories it lost during the century of humiliation, the provinces of Outer Manchuria are still under Russian control. Given that China is still pressing claims on areas it had long lost any legal ties on and are loosely historically connected to China, such as the claims in the South China Sea, it's highly likely to reverse course on its previous agreements with Russia and claim back the lost provinces in Manchuria. Considering the present economic and demographic inequality between the regions separated by the Amur and Ussuri, China's invasion would likely be swift and deadly. In all likelihood, it would displace or culturally assimilate the Russians in the area before reinforcements from the European parts of Russia could arrive. Since the area is already starting to be influenced by China due to ongoing trade, it's also possible that China might imitate the Russian annexation of Crimea to gain access to the Japanese Sea. Alternatively, it might begin its advance into the rest of the Russian Far East. In essence, what is currently happening in Ukraine could be repeated. In the way Russia wants to diversify its port access and limit the influence of other countries on its economy, China could do the same thing in the future to Russia. With Russia weakened from the war, it's unlikely to remain the world's 11th economy for long and will likely be shattered by conflicting ideologies from within. That would leave Russia underpopulated, underrepresented, and underdeveloped. Yet the resource-rich and highly lucrative Far East will be ripe for the taking by the country that stands to gain the most from utilizing those resources: China. The only question that remains is how China will actually attack Russia. While China's current policy is non-interference, the country could reverse that course and try to sponsor a deal between Russia and Ukraine. During peace accords, China may impose its own influence on both Russia and Ukraine, forcing either country to accept whatever terms China deems best for its own agenda. In exchange, China would fund reconstruction and reinvigoration efforts in the war-struck areas of Ukraine. On the surface, the EU would likely welcome this deal, as Ukraine's reconstruction efforts are most likely going to be funded by the EU. Talks about the country joining the EU in an expedited process have been underway for some time. This would also suit China's plans to undercut the US influence around the world. If the EU doesn't have to support yet another country and can rely on Chinese-brought infrastructure in Ukraine, the US doesn't have as much leverage. While the EU is currently importing Norwegian and American oil and gas, the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war could drastically change the trading routes on a global scale. With Russia free to resume exporting oil and gas to Europe, the US will lose one of its biggest export partners. It's currently unknown whether Russia can actually satisfy the needs of both China and the EU, but China could support the trade if it retains its influence on Russian politics and economy. Even if China doesn't create a lucrative offer to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, it could end the war forcefully by pulling the plug on economically supporting Russia. While Russia would likely retaliate by cutting off the resources from Siberia, China could open up claims to Outer Manchuria as a proxy. By invading Russia, it can take hold of the resources itself and cut out the middleman from the equation. Before long, China could feasibly gain access to the Sea of Japan, or even freezing Siberian ports in the Arctic, allowing it to bypass the Strait of Malacca and place its products directly into Western Europe. In the end, while Russia and China's current stance is that the countries have an alliance, in actuality, Russia is only a few steps away from becoming China's vassal or being attacked by China's numerically superior forces while being completely unprotected from Europe. Then it's up to China to decide what claims it would pursue, and to the US and the rest of the Quad to determine how to proceed in creating a new world order. It should be mentioned that all of these scenarios are only rough approximations or conjectures. Each one is based on the current events in Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics surrounding the China-US rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. If something drastically changes in the foreign policies of either of the parties, China could be facing a much worse war against the entirety of the US and the Quad before it strikes against Russia. But what do you think? Is China going to attack Russia, or is it still too afraid of American countermeasures? In the event China does attack, will it press far into Siberia or settle by regaining the region of Outer Manchuria? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. Located approximately 400 kilometers west of the Russian mainland, around 1,300 kilometers from Moscow, Kaliningrad is bordered to the north and south by Lithuania and Poland. Essentially, it's a Russian outpost, but one that's had a growing strategic significance due to its close proximity to a large number of major European cities. Kaliningrad also has the only port on the Baltic Sea that remains ice-free all year, making it the ideal home for the Russian Navy's Baltic fleet. Originally founded in the 13th century, this historic oblast is home to nearly 500,000 people, but also serves as a key strategical element in Russia's anti-NATO strategy. Recently, however, as Putin struggles to maintain Russia's status as a global superpower, Kaliningrad has become as much of a headache for him as it's been an asset, and could become a serious liability to his campaign of aggressive expansion in Ukraine and beyond. For one, Russia's military forces remain overextended as the war in Ukraine drags on, leaving Kaliningrad largely out from under Putin's thumb, which may be why we're hearing a clear call for dissension rising up among its separatist groups. Emboldened by the hardships of the war, the leaders of the Baltic Republican Party have been calling not only for independence from Russia, but also for Kaliningrad to align with the West and its allies against the Russian president. Since the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, Moscow has enhanced both aerial and naval connections between the Russian mainland and Kaliningrad. Given Russia's current struggles in Ukraine, however, it seems unlikely that it will achieve its overall objective and isolate the Baltics. And as political pressures within Russia intensify and external pressures build due to the fallout of the war in Ukraine, the possibility of Russia losing Kaliningrad altogether has grown increasingly likely. If this happens, it will undoubtedly alter not only Russia's future, but also the futures of Europe, America, and various other parts of the world. So what's happening? How is Russia losing control of Kaliningrad? And perhaps a more important question, what consequences will there be if it does? In this video, we're going to take a look at these questions, while also closely examining the events that led up to this pivotal moment in Kaliningrad's long history. To really understand what the impact of losing Kaliningrad would be, we must first understand the influence it's had on Russia's recent history. Rewinding back to the first months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin found himself in desperate need of the Kaliningrad exclave. Rather quickly, what Putin thought would be a swift blitzkrieg all the way to Kyiv instead turned out to be something else entirely, as many of Russia's frontline troops ended up in hasty retreat from key regions such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. This grievous miscalculation left Russia wide open to the possibility of a devastating counteroffensive. So Putin turned to one of the most powerful weapons in his arsenal, the threat of nuclear retaliation. And what has helped make this weapon an even more credible deterrent? That's right, Kaliningrad. To get the ball rolling as early as May 2022, as much of the Russian army fell into retreat, Putin initiated a series of provocative military exercises in Kaliningrad, with the intention of demonstrating that he could, hypothetically, launch nuclear warheads all across Europe. During the exercises, Russian troops practiced electronic launches of nuclear-capable Iskander mobile ballistic systems, the same systems being used against Ukraine. And for what ultimate purpose? Essentially, Putin wanted to make the point that as long as he controlled Kaliningrad, no NATO member state would be beyond his reach. What's interesting about these maneuvers, though, is that the primary goal of them may not have been to remind the West that Russia has nukes, but rather to remind them that Russia has Kaliningrad. It's hard to forget that Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, but it's much easier to forget, or at least to underestimate, the strategic importance of this relatively unassuming Baltic Sea exclave. This, however, would be a mistake. And for one very good reason, the Suwalki Gap, which is, according to many military analysts, by far NATO's weakest point. But more on that later. For now, it's important to note that Kaliningrad was not always a part of Russia. It was founded in 1255 by the Teutonic Knights under the name Königsberg on the site of the ancient old Prussian settlement of Twangstay. From then up until World War II, Königsberg would serve as Germany's easternmost major city. But after Germany's surrender in July and August of 1945, as part of the Potsdam Conference, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee, and US President Harry Truman effectively redrew Europe's borders, and in the end, Königsberg was handed over to the Soviet Union and renamed Kaliningrad in honor of Bolshevik revolutionary Mikhail Kalinin. Unsurprisingly, the region experienced a notable demographic shift as the German population was expelled and the Soviet citizens came flooding in. But as Europe has continued to evolve over the past 79 years, the Russian oblast has become increasingly isolated, and this isolation has only been exacerbated since the invasion of Ukraine. As neighboring countries close their borders, NATO expands its membership, and the Kremlin remains focused on waging war. So far, some 5,000 Kaliningrad residents have been mobilized to fight in Ukraine, with an estimated 450 being killed in action already. The authorities in Kaliningrad, however, rarely discuss casualties, focusing instead on its contributions to the war effort, which has included quadcopters, camouflage nets, and clothes. A significant portion of its 2024 budget will also be allocated to help finance the war. And in return, Moscow has been pouring money into Kaliningrad to help mitigate the impact of Western sanctions and bolster the exclave's vast military infrastructure. Moscow has also shown great interest in preparing Kaliningrad to operate independently, mostly via infrastructure projects that would reduce its dependence on neighboring countries just in case it becomes cut off from the Russian mainland. and bolstering Kaliningrad's autonomy is probably a good idea, given NATO's continued expansion that includes the accession of Finland and Sweden into the alliance. At this moment, as the NATO net surrounding Kaliningrad gets increasingly tighter, the Baltic Sea is beginning to look more like the NATO Sea. But what this really means for the isolated exclave is that it doesn't need any more problems with its neighbours. Wedged in between the NATO and EU member states of Poland and Lithuania, Kaliningrad relies heavily on its neighbours for food, but also remains dependent on mainland Russia for a number of other necessary goods. And every year, millions of tons of Russian oil, coal, and coke, a carbonaceous material used in the production of steel, are transported by rail through Lithuania. Over the past several years, however, the relationship between Lithuania and Russia has gotten increasingly rocky. For one thing, right around the time of Russia's massive Zapad 2017 military exercise, Lithuania built a new border fence. And for two, Lithuanian helicopters have been known to hover over the railway when Russian military trains are passing through, possibly conducting surveillance. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, though, things have gone from bad to worse. Due to EU sanctions, nearly half of all the goods that would normally pass through Lithuania, in or out of Kaliningrad, including coal, metal, construction materials, and various modern technologies, are now banned from entering any EU territory. And even before these rail sanctions, there was the implementation of the EU's flight ban, which forced Lithuania to close its airspace to flights from Russia to Kaliningrad, forcing commercial carriers to use a longer route that took them out over the Baltic Sea. Unfortunately, the people most affected by these sanctions are the people of Kaliningrad. In response, Kaliningrad's governor, Anton Alikhanov, assured worried citizens that regular ferry services from St. Petersburg would help soften the blow. For their part, Russia's foreign ministry has accused Lithuania of violating international agreements that facilitate transit from mainland Russia, while the Kremlin denounced Lithuania's actions as a blockade against its citizens and threatened ambiguous consequences. In its defense, the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry said it was simply complying with EU sanctions and clarified that the transit of passengers and non-sanctioned goods to and from Kaliningrad through Lithuania would continue uninterrupted. But just to be on the safe side, Lithuania also ramped up its railway security measures and established a permanent helicopter presence over certain sections of track. However ruffled Putin's feathers might be, though, he better be careful not to bite off more than he can chew. Lithuania has been a member of NATO for 2 decades, which means that any direct military action from Russia will invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, obligating the entire alliance to come to its defense. During his 2022 State of the Union address, US President Joe Biden even pledged to defend all NATO territory, then expanded the US's troop presence in Lithuania by around 1,000 soldiers. Which brings us back to the Suwalki Gap. Stretching around 100 kilometers along the Lithuanian-Polish border, the gap separates Kaliningrad from the pro-Russian state of Belarus. So why is this a major concern for the West? Well, a fortified Russian presence along the gap would isolate Lithuania and Latvia from Poland and the rest of the EU. This is why a number of Western militaries believe that if war in Ukraine escalates into a full-on hot war with NATO, this corridor will be one of Russia's first targets. Because in the event of a conflict with Russia, the location of the Suwalki Gap would make it nearly impossible for NATO forces to reinforce the Baltic states. Russia could easily add heavy fortifications to this narrow strip of land, making it a potential death trap for NATO troops. Various wargame simulations have predicted catastrophic casualties if NATO forces attempt to pass through it. Putin's perceived willingness to sacrifice the lives of his troops would also give him a strategic advantage in using the Suwalki Gap to isolate the Baltic states and maintain his foothold in Kaliningrad. Hypothetically, Russia could sweep into the corridor simultaneously from east and west, cutting off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from the rest of NATO. But this move would also lead to an immediate confrontation between Moscow and NATO's many nuclear-armed members, which, if not de-escalated very carefully, could lead to an unprecedented catastrophe. If Putin does ultimately move against, let's say, Poland or Lithuania, it would certainly trigger NATO's mutual defense provision. But what NATO's actual response would be still remains unclear. For now, the Baltic's vulnerability to Russian aggression is central among NATO's many concerns. Exacerbated by Russia's actions in Ukraine, this has led to a shift in NATO's approach to security. And as they consider stationing more troops in the region to deter a potential assault, even skeptics now recognize the need for forward defense in Eastern Europe. The Suwalki Corridor's significance has taken the stage again recently, after Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki raised concerns about the Wagner PMC, or the Wagner Group, a volatile Russian mercenary group who is reportedly operating in the area. Intelligence reports have indicated that over 100 Wagner mercenaries have been deployed near the Suwalki Gap, in close proximity to Grodno in Belarus. Morawiecki's primary concern is that these mercenaries might be posing as Belarusian border guards or migrants as they try to infiltrate Polish territory in an attempt to further destabilize the region. Given how important Poland's military is to the region's defense, Putin might just try to exploit the historical tensions that exist between Poland and Lithuania surrounding the Suwalki Gap, a similar tactic he used in Donbass. The Wagner Group lost some of its credibility after a recent mutiny among its fighters, yet this also proved that the group was ready to employ brutal tactics to advance its mysterious political and military objectives. Supported by some influential Russian elites, the Wagner Group has attracted the attention of both the West and the Kremlin, which ultimately made a deal with them to end the mutiny. As a result, a significant number of Wagner fighters were relocated to Belarus. What's also concerning are the rumors that the Wagner Group played a role in the recent military coup in Niger, which ousted the country's pro-Western democratically elected government. Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin applauded the coup, and the new military leadership in Niger were quick to welcome the support. So, could the Wagner PMC act as a similar destabilizing force in Eastern Europe? That's certainly one of NATO's concerns at the moment. Putin's motive for enlisting these unruly mercenaries is likely not related to territorial expansion, but to probe NATO's resolve, using a series of strategically orchestrated moves. What can they do when the instigators are non-state actors, such as the Wagner Group? It's this ambiguity that gives Russia a buffer of plausible deniability. To stay ahead of this fiasco, NATO needs to rely on improved surveillance measures, enhanced intelligence sharing, and a unified approach to responding to such conflicts. Despite all the hype surrounding the Suwalki Gap, however, there are some who believe its importance has been overblown, that its perceived strategic significance stems from a misconception regarding its military value and potential vulnerability. For some, it's unclear just why Russia would need to physically close the gap or seize territory in the Baltic states to cut off potential NATO reinforcements. In a major military confrontation between Russia and NATO forces, geographical boundaries wouldn't really matter. Plus, the Suwalki Gap lacks natural features that would present any unique military challenges or opportunities. And besides, any aggressive action in the region would create significant political challenges for Moscow and likely lead to the invocation of Article 5, which Putin does not want. The military threat associated with the Suwalki Gap is also not one-sided. NATO forces could easily get the drop on Russian assets in the region, including those in Kaliningrad. In its efforts to secure the gap, Russia would also likely face a range of logistical challenges, similar to those they ran into during the invasion of Ukraine. If the gap's strategic value is taken too seriously, some analysts have warned the US and its NATO allies might be prompted to deploy a significant military presence to the region, which might only create other problems. Massed troops might just end up being prime targets for Russian long-range strikes. Putin would likely also interpret such a strong military presence as a potential threat, one capable of launching an attack on Kaliningrad or Belarus and perhaps provoking an exaggerated response. Heavily militarizing this region could also provoke other NATO countries to take action, ones that might have been previously hesitant to confront Russia, leading to further escalation of this already complex situation. This does not suggest that the region between Poland and Lithuania, which is an internationally recognized border between two NATO and EU member states, lacks strategic importance. But it might be a better idea to focus on the more vulnerable areas of NATO's eastern flank instead, the towns and communities in the Baltic countries, especially Latvia and Estonia that are nearest to the Russian border. Dispersal of military elements rather than concentration would create more opportunities for engagement with NATO military forces and likely be a better deterrent of Russian aggression. Another and perhaps bigger issue we should be concerned about right now is Russia's long-range missile capabilities, which do not depend on the Suwalki Gap to be effective. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in fact, Kaliningrad became crucial for Russia's defense strategy, which has consisted primarily of demonstrating its nuclear capabilities in the hope of deterring NATO intervention. Even if Putin has, in the past, been liberally threatening nuclear war, it's likely been more to influence public opinion and not as a serious threat of military action. History suggests that nuclear threats are rarely acted upon. Even in past conflicts such as the Korean War, not to mention the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia didn't use nuclear weapons, which is why most experienced world leaders, keeping in mind the low probability of actual nuclear retaliation, are unlikely to be swayed or provoked by mere nuclear saber-rattling. And perhaps Putin has been catching on to this notion as well, because as of late it's been Russia's more nationalist hardliners calling for nuclear action, while Putin has been content to sit back and present himself as a force for reason, although never actually taking the threat off the table. Some of Russia's hardliners have even argued that an atomic blast in Ukraine, in Europe, or maybe in a test over Siberia will be the only way to reignite the fear of Russian aggression in the West. Former chairman of Russia's Federation Council, Sergei Mironov, who is now the leader of the A Just Russia party, said recently that any attempt by the West to enter the Baltic region would be a real red line, or rather a red button, that Russia would be forced to press. Mironov seems to think that just because Russia is a nuclear power, that it would be justified in using its capability to defend its territory. And by its territory he means every Russian region, regardless of whether the West recognize it as such or not. Mironov also went on to repeat the usual Kremlin rhetoric about invading Ukraine solely in retaliation to NATO actions and to rid the country of neo-Nazis. This scenario, however, has become somewhat typical in Moscow, with Russian hardliners spouting off about using or testing nuclear weapons, while Putin presents himself as the sole moderator, holding back the dogs of nuclear war. Rightfully suspicious of Putin's cool attitude, American and European officials have begun to speculate. Several factors, they believe, have contributed to the Russian president's somewhat more rational approach to nuclear weapons. For one, he may still be recovering from the backlash from China, India, and others who warned him there was no justification for using nuclear weapons. He might also be feeling more confident about his position in Ukraine. Either way, he still found the opportunity recently to casually mention that Moscow had successfully tested a terrifying new nuclear-powered cruise missile, one with a global range that's part of Russia's expanding arsenal of strategic nuclear weapons. Putin has also warned that if Finland and Sweden join NATO, Russia would have no choice but to strengthen its defenses in the Baltic region, which would include the deployment of nuclear weapons. Lithuanian Defense Minister Arvydas Anušauskas, however, has long insisted that Russia has had nuclear weapons stored in Kaliningrad for some time. His claims have not been independently verified, but other reports have indicated that in recent years, Russia's nuclear weapons storage bunkers in Kaliningrad have been upgraded. Both Finland and Sweden have been official partners of NATO since 1994 and have made significant contributions to the alliance's missions. But on April 4, 2023, after Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan withdrew a series of objections, Finland became the newest NATO member, increasing the number of member states to 31, and paving the way for Sweden's application and impending acceptance into the Western Defence Alliance. The decision made by both of these Nordic nations to join NATO marks a significant shift from their historically neutral positions. But there's no secrets surrounding what ultimately inspired them. The invasion of Ukraine shattered the long-standing sense of stability in Northern Europe, which left both Sweden and Finland feeling increasingly vulnerable to potential threats. For many Finns, the war in Ukraine sparked haunting memories of the 1939 Soviet invasion, which resulted in the loss of significant territory and raised serious concerns about the security of Finland's border with Russia. Over the past decade, Sweden has also had to reassess its potential vulnerability. In 2013, Russian bomber planes simulated an attack on Stockholm. Then in 2014, there were reports of a Russian submarine lurking in Swedish waters. Then in 2018, there was the countrywide distribution of army pamphlets titled "If Crisis or War Comes," which hinted to the growing concerns regarding national security within the Swedish government. While both nations have been rightfully worried about potential repercussions from Russia, it became clear that NATO membership was a necessary step to ensure their security in a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. Joining NATO will provide them with the same security guarantees under Article 5 as any other member. With Finland and Sweden deciding to join up, it seems that more and more of Putin's red lines keep getting crossed without retaliation. And as Western nations continue sending tanks and missile systems to Ukraine, not to mention training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s, President Biden and his NATO friends have seemingly begun to relax. To be clear, no one is saying that Putin absolutely won't resort to using nuclear weapons against Ukraine or its allies, especially if he starts to lose territory in Crimea, but as the war drags on, it seems less likely he will voluntarily kick off the apocalypse. Which is why, no matter how disastrous the war in Ukraine ends up, examining certain more realistic outcomes is helpful too. One issue of great future importance that has been widely debated among Western analysts is Russia's future ability to restore its military strength. For this matters, especially when we're looking at the future of the Baltic region, which will undoubtedly remain a crucial strategic junction for both Russia and NATO. For now, it seems that the substantial investment Moscow has made to modernize its military has been largely squandered, and that Russia's weakened economy likely won't be able to sustain any similar investment for many years. Whenever this war ends, it will also be imperative to restore the global framework for strategic, non-strategic nuclear arms control, to re-establish these agreements and standards that have been seriously eroded by the escalation of Russian nuclear rhetoric and blackmail will be especially vital for Moscow if it wants to be welcomed back to the international bargaining table. Certain members of Moscow's expert community, mainly risk-averse political elites and some senior military officials, have more and more begun to push back against reckless nuclear saber-rattling, recognizing the utter impracticality of nuclear warfare, especially given the state of Russia's armed forces. But still, Putin has adamantly rejected any proposal to reduce Russia's nuclear arsenal. So as it looks now, whoever comes after Putin will have the challenge of shifting the government away from a nuclear-centric, even nuclear-worshipping mindset. Putin's successor will also have to face the strategic reality that if the war in Ukraine is still going, they will need to de-escalate tensions in the Nordic-Baltic region to avoid a potentially unwinnable arms race with NATO. But for now, Putin is still in charge, and he seems perfectly content to rely on veiled nuclear threats to hopefully deter the West and possibly distract them from Kaliningrad's potential strategic importance. And this may work for a time, but time is what Putin seems to be running out of, as groups of increasingly vocal separatists continue to threaten Russia's hold on the Kaliningrad exclave. Ever since Kaliningrad became a Russian exclave, there have been whispers among native intellectuals about the possibility of one day achieving independence. For many years, there weren't any grassroots sectionist movements, but there was enough talk to spark fears of separatism in Moscow, fears that were largely fueled by objective factors like Kaliningrad's far-out geographical position, which makes it all that much more susceptible to foreign influence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, and on through the 1990s, there were repeated public calls for Kaliningrad to become the Fourth Baltic Republic. But because of the oblast's importance as home to Russia's Baltic fleet, which could no longer use ports in the Baltic countries, Moscow cracked down hard on that sentiment. But in the 21st century, as economic conditions have worsened, and the contrast between life in the exclave and life in Lithuania or Poland has increased, separatist sentiments are once again on the rise. As a result of this, the influence of Russia's state media also appears to be waning in the region, despite Moscow's efforts to combat what it's called a growing enthusiasm for Germanization and creeping separatism. These efforts have included expelling German-backed NGOs, launching campaigns against the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and dismissing academics with ties to cultural organizations in Germany. And as information remains scarce due to Kremlin censorship, assessing the true extent of support for independence proves challenging, with many residents remaining cautious about openly advocating for secession. Perhaps the loudest voice at the moment, though, is that of the Baltic Republican Party, or BRP, which was founded in 1993 by Königsberg natives, also known as Baltic Russians. In an uncommon display of protest just before the invasion of Ukraine, protests erupted outside the Russian embassy in Warsaw, as members of the BRP demanded demilitarization of the exclave. A year later, an unauthorized and potentially illegal online referendum took place in 5 Russian regions. Some 95,567 people participated, about 19.4% of the population, and all the regions that were polled voted in favor of independence. Much of the information we have comes from reporting outside Russia or reports made prior to the war in Ukraine, so it's possible that results simply reflect the bias towards pro-independence sentiment among the participants. But if anything, the referendum still served as a potential reminder that there are still those eager for independence. Perhaps encouraged by the vote, despite the Kremlin's efforts to stifle separatist movements through censorship and media restrictions, the BRP believes secession from Russia is only a matter of time. To make their point, when referring to the exclave, the party uses the name Königsberg, the German name for the city before it was handed over to the Soviet Union after World War II, claiming that it rightfully belongs to Europe. Party membership, they also say, has been steadily increasing both within Königsberg and the region surrounding it. One day, one way or another, the war in Ukraine will come to an end. And when it does, the structure of the Russian Federation will almost certainly change. If Russia prevails, well, life in Kaliningrad will likely not improve, but there are also many other scenarios that could lead to greater autonomy and even full independence for the former German city. With that said, the Kremlin has no intention of losing any part of its empire and will therefore continue to crack down on separatism. Even with the support from its European neighbors, unless drastic post-war changes occur within Russian society, Kaliningrad's sovereignty may remain out of reach for some time to come. In the meantime, the desire to revitalize East Prussian culture and the goal of an independent Königsberg will persist, likely until the right time and conditions for making the first steps in this direction are met. Unfortunately, the future of the Kaliningrad exclave will largely depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And when it ends, the stage will either be set for freedom or the dream may die forever. It couldn't hurt to ask, with all the changes happening in the Baltic region lately, what are the chances Russia simply loses interest in Kaliningrad? Some might even say that when Finland and Sweden officially joined NATO, aligning themselves with Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, Kaliningrad shifted from a strategic asset for Russia to more of a burdensome liability. In a very short time, Russia's chances of creating a chokehold for NATO at the Suwalki Gap went from good to nearly impossible. And on top of that, NATO now has the ability to bypass the gap entirely, deploying troops from the north, across the sea, or via air routes, keeping their distance from Kaliningrad's missile batteries and anti-air defense systems. These developments have fundamentally transformed the strategic significance of Kaliningrad, so much so that the French Institute of International Relations recently declared that the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has largely upended Russian strategic planning and that its goal to exploit military superiority has been lost. The report also pointed out that during the first phase of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia redeployed its most combat-capable units, including its Air Assault Division and Marine Brigade, to support its offensive operations there, while at the same time, all amphibious capabilities of the Baltic Fleet were dispatched to the Black Sea. Now these units are fully engaged in countering the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has left Fortress Kaliningrad largely undefended. To Russia's credit, they have maintained unrestricted access to Belarus, but its current shortage of forces limits the benefit of this alliance. Lately, Russian and Belarusian forces have come together for a number of military exercises, including the Zapad 2021 exercises, but it's mostly been Russia's aerospace forces that are using Belarusian airbases for attack missions in Ukraine. Russian ground troops have, too, been consuming large amounts of ammunition from Belarus's pre-war arsenal. It's Putin's deployment of non-strategic nuclear warheads to Belarus, though, that could create the most trouble down the road. Complicating things for Belarus even further was the arrival of several thousand Wagner mercenaries after the failed mutiny in June 2023. Lacking any real sense of organization or heavy weapons, these guns for hire simply weren't capable of turning the tide in Ukraine or posing any real threat to Belarus's NATO member neighbors. But they did, as mentioned earlier, stir things up around the Suwalki Gap. But even though they make them a bit nervous, Poland is fully capable of addressing the Wagner threat. What's less clear is why Putin thought it would be a good strategy to relocate this unstable group of mercenaries just 25 kilometers from his base in Asivapichi, the supposed location of Russia's nuclear warheads. With everything that's happened, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, Russia has little chance of re-establishing its previous military authority in the Baltic theater, or even matching its regional forces with NATO's. Putin will probably continue to lean on trusted deterrent strategies like nuclear saber-rattling and so on, hoping that the West will take into consideration all the urban targets that are within reach of his Kalibr and Iskander missiles. Or he may just go all the way and openly deploy nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad. But in the end, these will only be half measures, and won't do much to shift the reality of Russia's crumbling strategic position. Perhaps the best future we can hope for right now is a post-Putin leadership that's less inclined to seek out militarized confrontation with the West and instead look for opportunities to restore cooperation and stability to the Baltic region. But what do you think? Is Kaliningrad the key to dominating the Baltic region? What will happen if Russia manages to close the Suwalki Gap? Are all Putin's nuclear threats just noise, or is he actually capable of pressing the button? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.